In 1883 Arizona Territory, a woman was sold on an auction block for $1, not as property, but as salvation. When Nora Hale whispered through tears, "You'll regret choosing me," the rancher who bought her freedom smiled and said, "I already regret waiting this long." This is their story, a tale of redemption forged in the unforgiving desert, where love became the only law that mattered. Stay until the end and comment your city below so I can see how far this story travels across the world. The Arizona sun was a merciless judge that August morning, hanging in the sky like a brass gong waiting to be struck. Its heat pressed down on the town of Salvation Creek with the weight of divine punishment, turning the air thick and suffocating. Dust devils spun lazily between the wooden buildings, carrying whispers of drought and desperation through streets that had seen too much suffering and not enough mercy. On the eastern edge of town, where respectability gave way to necessity, a crowd had gathered in the town square. They came like vultures to carrion, ranchers with sun-weathered faces and calculating eyes, merchants seeking cheap labor, opportunists hunting for bargains written in human flesh. The auction block stood in the center of it all, a crude wooden platform stained dark from years of sweat and shame. Nora Hale stood on that platform with her bare feet burning against the sun-heated wood, her wrists bound with rough hemp rope that had already rubbed her skin raw. She was 23 years old, though hardship had carved lines around her green eyes that made her look older, wiser, more dangerous than her years suggested. Her dark hair hung in tangled waves around her shoulders, unwashed and uncombed, streaked with the red dust of 3 days' travel in a wagon cage. Her dress, if the tattered gray shift could be called such, hung from her thin frame like a burial shroud, torn at the shoulder and stained with dried blood from a wound she'd gotten fighting back when they first took her. But it was her eyes that made grown men look away. They held no plea for mercy, no tears, no feminine softness that might have stirred compassion in harder hearts. Instead, they blazed with a defiance that was almost feral, the look of a wounded animal that would bite even as the trap closed around its neck. She had been beaten, starved, dragged across half of Arizona in chains, and still she stood on that platform like a queen surveying her executioners, daring them to look at what they had become. "All right, gentlemen, settle down now," the auctioneer's voice boomed across the square. His name was Cyrus Wheaton, a portly man with a handlebar mustache stained yellow from tobacco and a smile that never reached his eyes. He wore a bowler hat and a vest that had once been fine, but now carried the sweat stains of too many transactions in human misery. "We've got ourselves a prime piece here. Yes, we do. Young, strong, got all her teeth." He grabbed Nora's jaw roughly, forcing her mouth open to display her teeth like she was a horse at market. She jerked her head away with such violence that Wheaton stumbled backward, nearly falling off the platform. The crowd roared with laughter. "Got some spirit, too." Wheaton recovered quickly, his smile tightening. "Nothing a firm hand can't tame, I reckon. Now, she's been in the care of the territorial marshal for the past week, arrested for vagrancy and public disturbance in Tombstone. No family to claim her, no money to pay her fines. The law says we can sell her contract of indenture for a period of no less than 1 year to cover the debt to society. Who'll start the bidding at $20? Silence fell over the crowd like a held breath. $20 was too much for a woman with defiance in her eyes and blood on her dress. The men shifted uncomfortably, calculating profit against trouble. "Come now, gentlemen," Wheaton's voice took on a desperate edge. "She can cook, she can clean, she can work the fields. Think of the labor she represents." "Can she warm a bed?" someone shouted from the back, and the crowd erupted in crude laughter. Nora's face remained impassive as stone, but her hands, bound as they were, clenched into white-knuckled fists. She would not cry. She would not beg. She had learned years ago that tears only encouraged cruelty. $15, Wheaton tried again. "Surely someone sees the value here." "I'll give you 10. The speaker was a rancher named Dutch Keller, a man known throughout the territory for working his horses until they died and treating his hired hands little better, but only if you throw in a bridle to match. The laughter that followed was uglier now, edged with a cruelty that made even some of the assembled men look uncomfortable. Nora stared directly at Dutch Keller, memorizing his face. If she survived this, she told herself, she would remember every man who laughed. $10. Wheaton seized on the offer like a drowning man grabbing driftwood. "We have $10. Do I hear 12? $5. Another voice, this one belonging to Abel Pritchard, who ran the general store and was known to work indentured servants in his stockroom 16 hours a day. And that's generous, given the look of her. She's half-starved and probably diseased. She ain't diseased, Wheaton protested. The doc checked her over. She's fit for work. Then maybe the doc should buy her, someone shouted, and more laughter rippled through the crowd. Nora felt something cold settle in her chest. $5. That's what her freedom was worth in this place. $5, less than the cost of a good saddle, less than a month's worth of whiskey, less than nothing. She had known she would be sold, had steeled herself for it during the long wagon journey from Tombstone, but hearing the numbers spoken aloud made it real in a way that turned her stomach to ice. Do I hear $5? Wheaton was sweating now, his voice taking on a pleading quality. Come on, gentlemen, let's not waste the morning. $5 for a year of labor. $3, Dutch Keller again, grinning like a wolf. Final offer. Take it or send her to the mining camps where she belongs. The mining camps. Even hardened criminals whispered about those places with fear. Women who went to the mining camps rarely came back, and those who did were broken things that barely remembered their own names. Nora felt her defiance waver for the first time, felt something that might have been fear pierce through the armor she'd built around her heart. Wheaton opened his mouth to accept the bid when a voice cut through the crowd, calm and quiet, but carrying somehow, like distant thunder before a storm. $1. Every head turned. The crowd parted slowly, men stepping aside to let the speaker through, and Nora found herself staring at a man who looked nothing like the leering predators who had been bidding on her flesh. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that spoke of hard labor and a lean waist that suggested he didn't waste his strength on soft living. His face was all hard angles and weathered skin, burned dark by years under the Arizona sun, with a strong jaw covered in several days' worth of dark stubble. His eyes were the color of desert stone, gray-blue and steady, and they looked at her not with hunger or contempt, but with something she couldn't quite name. He wore simple working clothes. Canvas pants, a faded blue shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, scuffed boots, and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. There was a quality of stillness about him, as if he carried his own gravity, and the chaos of the world simply flowed around him without touching the center of who he was. Jack Callahan. Nora didn't know his name yet, but she would later learn that he owned a small ranch 15 miles outside of Salvation Creek, that he had come to town for supplies and happened to pass through the square, that he was known as a fair man who paid his debts and minded his own business. The kind of man who went unnoticed in a territory full of loudmouths and braggarts, which made him more dangerous than all of them combined. The crowd exploded with laughter so loud it startled a pair of ravens from the roof of the saloon. $1! Dutch Keller slapped his knee, wheezing with amusement. You hear that, boys? Callahan's finally lost his mind. Must be the loneliness out at that ranch making him crazy. That's an insult to the process, Wheaton sputtered, his face turning red. $1 is a mockery of these proceedings. It's a bid, Jack said calmly, not raising his voice. You called for bids. I'm bidding. We already have a bid for $3. Wheaton jabbed a finger toward Dutch. You can't go lower than the previous bid. That's not how auctions work. You asked who would take her. Jack's voice remained level, but there was something in it now, an edge like a blade being drawn slowly from a sheath. I will, for $1. That's not... Wheaton started, but Jack continued as if he hadn't spoken. Not to own her, he said, and suddenly the laughter died like someone had thrown a blanket over a fire. To free her. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the desert wind seemed to hold its breath. Nora stared at this stranger with his steady eyes and impossible words, certain she had misheard, certain this was some cruel joke that would end with more laughter and her being dragged to the mining camps anyway. What did you say? Wheaton's voice had gone very quiet. I said, I'm buying her contract for $1, Jack repeated. And the moment that dollar changes hands, I'm tearing up that contract. She walks free. That's... Dutch Keller stepped forward, his amusement replaced by something uglier. That's not legal. You can't just free her. The contract says 1 year of indenture. The contract says the buyer owns the term of service, Jack replied, still in that same unshakable calm. Once I own it, I can do whatever I want with it, including ending it. This is an outrage, Abel Pritchard pushed through the crowd. You're making a mockery of the law. The law says she can be bought. Jack finally raised his voice, just slightly, but the change was enough to make several men take an unconscious step backward. It doesn't say what happens after. Or are you gentlemen suggesting that once you buy something, you don't have the right to dispose of it as you see fit? It was perfectly logical, and everyone in the square knew it. The territorial laws were clear. An indenture contract was property, and once purchased, the buyer could do anything with it, work the servant, sell the contract to someone else, or yes, even terminate it early. It almost never happened, but there was no law against it. Wheaton looked around desperately, seeking support, but found only confused faces and a few men who looked almost ashamed of themselves. He turned back to Jack with desperation in his eyes. "Why would you do this?" he asked, and for the first time his voice carried genuine bewilderment instead of greed. "Why would you waste money to free some vagrant girl? What's she to you?" Jack was quiet for a long moment. His eyes moved from Wheaton to Nora, meeting her gaze directly for the first time. She saw no pity there, no savior complex, no hidden agenda written in his features. What she saw instead was something that made her throat tight, recognition, as if he was looking at her and seeing not a piece of property or a problem to be solved, but a human being who deserved better than this. "Nothing," he said finally. "She's nothing to me. But she's something to herself. And that's enough." He pulled a silver dollar from his pocket and held it up. The coin caught the sunlight, flashing like a promise. "Do we have a deal?" he asked Wheaton. The auctioneer looked at the dollar, then at the crowd, then back at Jack. His mouth worked silently for a moment before he finally threw up his hands in defeat. "Fine," he snapped. "Fine. Let it be on your head, Callahan. $1 for the contract of Nora Hale." He snatched the coin from Jack's hand and pulled a rolled document from his vest. "Sign here. And when she ends up robbing you blind or cutting your throat in your sleep, don't come crying to the marshal." Jack took the contract and a pen, signing his name with quick, efficient strokes. The moment the ink dried, he tore the paper cleanly in half, then in half again, letting the pieces flutter to the ground like wounded birds. "There," he said, "contract fulfilled." Then he did something that shocked Nora more than anything else that morning. He stepped up onto the platform, not rushed, not aggressive, just steady and purposeful, and moved toward her. She tensed, every muscle in her body coiling to fight or flee. But he stopped just out of arm's reach and looked down at the ropes binding her wrists. "May I?" he asked quietly, and it took her a moment to realize he was asking permission to touch her. She stared at him, this impossible man who had just bought her freedom for $1 and was now asking her consent to untie her. Slowly, not trusting her voice, she nodded. Jack moved closer, and she caught his scent, leather and sage and clean sweat, nothing like the sour smell of the men who had been bidding on her. His hands were careful as they worked the knots, his fingers rough with calluses but gentle in their handling. He didn't pull or yank at the rope, didn't cause her any more pain than necessary. Instead, he took his time, loosening each coil with methodical patience until the hemp fell away and her wrists were free. Nora brought her hands up slowly, staring at them as if they belonged to someone else. The skin was raw and bleeding where the rope had cut into her, but they were her hands again, free. She flexed her fingers, watching tendons move under skin, and felt something crack open inside her chest, something that might have been hope or might have been terror. She couldn't tell which. "Can you walk?" Jack asked, and there was no judgment in the question, just practical concern. She nodded again, not trusting herself to speak. Her throat felt full of ground glass and unshed tears. "Then walk off this platform under your own power," he said, "and don't look back at any of them." It was good advice. Nora took a shaky breath, squared her shoulders, and stepped down from the auction block. Her bare feet hit the dirt of the town square, and she walked, not ran, walked, through the crowd of men who had been ready to buy her like livestock. She kept her eyes straight ahead, her chin up, her hands loose at her sides. Behind her, she heard Dutch Keller spit in disgust, and someone else mutter about fool do-gooders, but she didn't turn around. Jack fell into step beside her, not touching, not crowding, just present like a wall between her and the world. They walked the length of the square in silence, and with each step Nora felt the invisible chains falling away, felt the weight of ownership lifting from her shoulders. By the time they reached the end of the street, she was shaking so hard she had to stop and brace herself against a hitching post. "You all right?" Jack asked. "Why did you do that?" The words came out harsh, almost accusatory. "What do you want from me?" He was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the desert that stretched beyond the edge of town. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft. "My sister," he said. "Elena. She was 17 when some men took her from our farm in Texas, sold her to a brothel in El Paso. By the time I tracked her down 3 years later, she was—" He stopped, his jaw working. "She was gone. Not dead, but not alive either. Everything that made her Elena had been beaten out of her. She died 6 months later of pneumonia, but really, she died the day those men took her." Nora felt her anger drain away, replaced by a hollow ache of understanding. "I couldn't save her," Jack continued. "I was too late, too slow, too damn useless. But when I saw you up there on that block, looking at those men like you were memorizing their faces for Judgment Day—" He turned to look at her, and she saw old grief in his eyes, and older rage. "I figured I could be on time just once. Could do one thing right." "You don't know me," Nora whispered. "I could be everything they said. A thief, a liar, worse." "Don't care." His voice was flat, final. "Whatever you are, whatever you've done, you didn't deserve that. Nobody deserves that." They stood there in the morning heat, two strangers bound together by $1 and a moment of grace. Nora felt tears threatening for the first time since her arrest, felt them burning behind her eyes like acid. She blinked them back fiercely. "I don't have anywhere to go," she admitted, hating how small her voice sounded. Jack nodded slowly, like he'd been expecting this. "I've got a ranch about 15 miles west. Small place, more dirt than grass, more problems than solutions. But there's a spare room if you need it. No strings, no obligations. You can stay until you figure out what comes next." "Why would you—" "Because everyone needs a place to catch their breath," he interrupted gently. "And maybe I've got a debt to pay forward that I couldn't pay back." Nora studied his face, searching for the lie, the trap, the hidden price. But all she saw was a tired man offering an honest hand to someone drowning. She had been drowning for so long she'd forgotten what solid ground felt like. "All right," she said finally, "but I work for my keep. I don't take charity." Something that might have been respect flickered in Jack's eyes. "Fair enough. Can you ride?" "Yes." "Then let's get you some boots and a canteen before we head out. Can't have you walking through the desert barefoot." He gestured toward the general store. "You good to go in there, or would you rather I bring things out to you?" The thoughtfulness of the question nearly undid her. "I can go in." They walked to Abel Pritchard's store together. The proprietor looked up as they entered, his face still sour from the auction, but he served them without comment. Jack bought her a pair of sturdy work boots, 2 pairs of thick socks, a simple cotton dress in dark blue, a wide-brimmed hat, a canteen, and a small leather satchel to carry it all. He paid cash without haggling, then guided Nora to the back room where she could change. The dress fit reasonably well, if a bit loose through the waist. The boots were stiff and uncomfortable, but they were hers, and that made them beautiful. Nora braided her hair with shaking fingers, settled the hat on her head, and looked at herself in the small mirror Pritchard kept for customers. She barely recognized the woman looking back at her. When she emerged, Jack was waiting with 2 horses, a sturdy bay gelding and a smaller paint mare. He helped her mount the mare without comment on her skill or lack thereof, then swung up onto his own horse with the easy grace of a man who'd spent his whole life in the saddle. "It's about a 3-hour ride," he said. "We'll take it easy. Stop if you need to rest." Nora nodded, gathering the reins in her blistered hands. As they turned their horses toward the western road, she heard a voice call out behind them. "Callahan!" They both turned. Dutch Keller stood in the middle of the street, his thumbs hooked in his belt, a sneer on his weathered face. "You're making a mistake," he called. "That girl's nothing but trouble. Mark my words, you'll regret it." Well, Jack regarded him for a long moment, then said clearly, so the whole street could hear, "Only thing I regret is that it took me this long to be standing right here, right now." He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was somehow both polite and dismissive, then clicked his tongue and urged his horse forward. Nora followed, her heart hammering in her chest, not daring to look back at the town where she had almost been sold for $3 and a laugh. They rode in silence for the first hour, leaving Salvation Creek behind until it was nothing but a smudge of brown buildings against the endless blue sky. The desert opened up around them, vast and empty and brutally honest in its hostility. The sun climbed higher, turning the air into a furnace. Buzzards circled overhead in lazy spirals. In the distance, red rock mesas rose like ancient cathedrals, and the mountains beyond shimmered with heat haze. Nora focused on staying in the saddle, on the rhythm of the horse's movement, on anything except the crushing enormity of what had just happened. She had been saved, rescued, freed. The words felt foreign in her mind, like a language she'd never learned to speak. Part of her kept waiting for Jack to turn around, to grin like a wolf, to tell her there was a price after all. But he just rode ahead, steady and silent, occasionally glancing back to make sure she was still with him. Finally, as they stopped to water the horses at a small spring, she found her voice again. "Jack Callahan," she said, testing his name. "That's what the auctioneer called you." "That's right." He loosened his horse's girth strap and let the animal drink. "Is it true? What you said about your sister?" His hand stilled on the leather. "Every word." "I'm sorry." "Me too." He was quiet for a moment, then added, "But being sorry doesn't change the past. Only thing we can do is try to make the future a little less terrible. For someone. Anyone." Nora knelt by the spring and cupped water in her hands, drinking deeply. The water was cool and sweet, tasting of minerals and stone. She splashed some on her face, washing away the dust and sweat, and when she looked up, she found Jack watching her with an expression she couldn't read. "You said back in town that I'd whisper, 'You'll regret choosing me,'" she said slowly. "But I never said that." "No," Jack agreed, "but I saw you thinking it, saw it in your eyes clear as words." Nora felt something in her chest tighten. "And what you said back about regretting waiting this long, did you mean that?" Jack settled his hat back on his head and gathered his horse's reins. "I meant I should have walked away from that crowd the moment I saw what they were about to do. Should have stopped it before it went as far as the auction block. Should have done a lot of things sooner." He swung back into his saddle with easy strength. "But we work with the time we're given, I suppose." They rode on. The land grew rougher, the trail winding between rock formations and dried creek beds. Jack pointed out landmarks as they went, a distinctive twisted tree where water could usually be found underground, a rock that looked like a sleeping bear, a canyon where flash floods came through in the monsoon season. He spoke like a man who knew this land in his bones, who had earned his knowledge through years of attention and respect. "How long have you been out here?" Nora asked as the afternoon shadows began to stretch long across the desert. 6 years, Jack said. "Came out from Texas after Elena died. Couldn't stay in that house anymore, couldn't look at her empty room. Figured I'd put as much distance between me and those memories as I could." He smiled without humor. "Turns out you can't outrun grief. It follows you like your own shadow. But at least out here there's space for it, room to breathe around the edges." "And you've been alone this whole time?" "Mostly. Had a hired hand for a year or so, but he moved on to better prospects. Get into town maybe once a month for supplies. Rest of the time it's just me, the land, and whatever livestock hasn't died yet." He glanced at her. "It's not an easy life. The ranch is small, the work is hard, and the desert doesn't give anything for free. If you're expecting comfort, you should know now that I can't offer it." "I'm not expecting anything," Nora said honestly. "I stopped having expectations a long time ago." Jack nodded like he understood. "Fair enough. Then how about we just take it one day at a time, see what happens?" "One day at a time," Nora echoed, and found the phrase settling into her bones like a prayer. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, they crested a small rise and Jack pointed ahead. "There," he said. "Home." The ranch was small, like he'd warned. A low adobe house with a wooden porch, a barn that had seen better days, a corral with split-rail fencing, and a windmill that creaked as it turned in the evening breeze. Beyond the buildings, scrubland stretched away in all directions, dotted with mesquite and sage and the occasional lonely cottonwood. It wasn't much. By most standards, it was barely anything at all. But to Nora, riding toward it on a horse that wasn't taking her to hell, with a man who had bought her freedom instead of her body, it looked like more than she'd dared to dream in years. They rode into the yard as the last light faded from the sky. Jack dismounted and came around to help Nora down, his hands careful on her waist. Her legs nearly buckled when her feet hit the ground. 3 hours of riding had taken their toll, but she forced herself to stand straight. "Barn first," Jack said, already leading his horse toward the weathered structure. "Animals come before comfort out here. That's the rule." Nora followed on unsteady legs, watching as he unsaddled both horses with efficient movements, rubbing them down with handfuls of straw and checking their hooves for stones. He showed her where the feed was kept, how much to give them, where the water trough needed to be filled. His teaching was patient and thorough, treating her like someone who deserved to understand rather than someone who just needed to obey. When the horses were settled, Jack lit a lantern and led her across the yard to the house. The door wasn't locked. Nora noticed there wasn't even a bolt, just a simple latch. Inside, the house was sparse but clean. A main room served as kitchen and living space, with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, shelves lined with a few books and supplies. 2 doors led off the main room, one clearly to Jack's bedroom, the other to a smaller space. Jack pushed open the second door and held the lantern high. The room was tiny, barely 8 feet square, with a narrow bed covered in a faded quilt, a small wooden chest, and a window with actual glass in it. A cross between a bedroom and a storage closet, but the bed looked clean and there was a hook on the back of the door. "It's not much," Jack said, echoing Nora's earlier thoughts. "But the door has a lock." He pointed to a simple bolt on the inside. "And I'm a sound sleeper. You won't be disturbed." Nora stepped into the room, running her hand over the quilt. It had been a long time since she'd slept in a bed. "It's perfect." Jack set the lantern on the chest. "There's a basin and pitcher for washing. Well's out back if you need more water. I'll get some food started if you want to clean up." He left, pulling the door closed behind him, and Nora stood alone in her small room with its lockable door and clean bed. Slowly, like she was afraid it might disappear if she moved too quickly, she slid the bolt home. The small metal sound it made was the sweetest thing she'd heard in years. She washed as best she could in the basin, scrubbing away days of grime and shame. Her wrists were still raw and painful, but the bleeding had stopped. In the mirror above the chest, she examined her face, too thin, too hard, too marked by suffering. But alive. Free. For whatever that was worth. When she emerged, Jack had laid out a simple meal on the table: cold meat, bread, cheese, and water. It wasn't fancy, but it was real food, honestly offered. They ate in companionable silence, Nora forcing herself to eat slowly even though her stomach screamed for her to devour everything in sight. "There's more if you want it," Jack said when she finished. "No rationing here." "I'm full," Nora lied, not wanting to seem greedy. Jack gave her a look that said he knew she was lying but wouldn't push. "Well, it'll keep. You get hungry later. Help yourself." He stood and began clearing the plates. "I usually rise before dawn, but you sleep as long as you need tomorrow. Let your body recover. There'll be plenty of time for work once you're rested." "I can start tomorrow," Nora insisted. "I said I'd work for my keep." "And you will," Jack agreed. "But not until you're ready. One day at a time, remember?" He showed her where the wash basin and chamber pot were kept, pointed out the privy behind the house, and gave her a thick candle for her room. Then he stood awkwardly by his own bedroom door, like he wasn't sure how to end this strange day. "Nora," he said finally, "I want you to know you're safe here. Whatever happened before, whatever you're running from or afraid of, it stops at my door. Nobody lays a hand on you while you're under my roof. That's a promise." Nora felt her throat tighten again. "Why? Why would you promise that to a stranger?" "Because someone should have promised it to Elena," Jack said simply. "And no one did." He bid her good night and disappeared into his room, leaving Nora standing in the main room with her candle and her confusion and her carefully guarded hope. She returned to her small room, locked the door again, and sat on the edge of the bed. Only then, in the darkness with no witnesses, did she allow herself to cry. She wept silently, biting her hand to muffle the sound, letting out years of fear and rage and grinding despair. She cried for the girl she'd been before the world broke her, for her sister who was lost somewhere she couldn't follow, for the auction block and the ropes and the men who had laughed while bidding on her flesh. But mostly she cried because for the first time in so long, someone had been kind to her without wanting anything in return, and she didn't know how to hold that kind of grace without it burning through her hands like hot coals. Eventually, exhaustion overtook her. Nora lay down on the clean bed, still wearing the blue dress Jack had bought her, and pulled the quilt up to her chin. Through the small window, she could see stars scattered across the desert night like diamonds on black velvet. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called out, lonely and wild and free. She fell asleep with one hand under the thin pillow, fingers wrapped around the small knife she'd managed to keep hidden through her arrest and journey. Trust was earned, not given, and she'd learned that lesson too well to forget it now. But the knife stayed sheathed, and her dreams, when they came, were blessedly free of auction blocks and leering faces. In the morning, she woke to the smell of coffee and frying bacon and found a single wildflower, a small purple desert aster, sitting in a tin cup on her windowsill. There was no note, no explanation, just the flower, fresh picked and offered without ceremony. Nora picked up the cup and held it carefully, studying the delicate petals. In all her years of surviving, no one had ever given her a flower just because. She carried it with her as she emerged from her room, finding Jack at the stove with his back to her, spatula in hand. "Morning," he said without turning around. "Coffee's on the table. Breakfast in 5 minutes." "Thank you," Nora said, and meant it for more than just the coffee. "For the flower." "Saw it on my way back from checking the stock," Jack replied, still focused on the bacon. "Figured it looked lonely out there all by itself." Nora smiled for the first time in longer than she could remember. "Yeah," she said softly. "I know the feeling." They ate breakfast as the sun rose over the desert, painting the world in shades of pink and gold. Outside, the land stretched away endlessly, harsh and unforgiving, but honest in its cruelty. And inside this small adobe house, with its simple furniture and locked doors, two broken people began the slow, careful work of learning to breathe again. It wasn't salvation. It wasn't redemption. It was just $1, a flower, and the promise of one more day. But for Nora Hale, who had been sold on an auction block for less than the price of a good meal, it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. The days that followed took on a rhythm that Nora had forgotten could exist, predictable but not oppressive, structured but not confining. She woke each morning to the sound of Jack moving quietly through the house, already dressed and preparing for the day's work. He never knocked on her door, never demanded she rise at any particular hour, but she found herself waking earlier and earlier anyway, drawn by the smell of coffee and the soft sounds of someone else's morning routine. On the third day, she emerged before dawn to find Jack at the table mending a bridle by lamplight. He looked up when she entered, nodded a greeting, and poured her a cup of coffee without asking if she wanted one. The gesture was so casual, so domestic, that it made her chest ache. "Sleep all right?" he asked, his attention back on the leather he was stitching. "Well enough." Nora wrapped her hands around the warm cup, letting the heat seep into her still cold fingers. October mornings in the desert carried a bite that surprised her. "What needs doing today?" Jack glanced at her, assessing. Her wrists were healing but still tender, and she moved carefully like someone learning to trust her body again. "Thought we might check the fence line on the eastern pasture. Few posts are loose and need resetting before winter. It's walking work, not heavy lifting. You up for it?" "Yes," Nora said immediately, desperate to prove her worth, to show she wasn't dead weight he'd have to carry. "Then we eat first. Can't work on an empty stomach." Jack made breakfast with the efficient movements of a man who'd been cooking for himself too long. Eggs from the handful of chickens he kept, bread toasted over the fire, more coffee. They ate in comfortable silence, and Nora marveled at how different this quiet was from the silence of fear. This was the quiet of two people who didn't need to fill every moment with words, who could simply exist in the same space without it being a battle. After breakfast, they walked out into the cool morning air. The sun was just beginning to paint the eastern sky pink, and the desert was that particular shade of blue that only existed in the hour before full dawn. Jack carried a bag of tools over his shoulder and a canteen on his hip. He'd given Nora a hat with a wider brim than her own and insisted she bring her canteen even though they'd only be gone a few hours. "Dessert will kill you if you're not careful," he'd said, and she'd heard the voice of experience in those words. They walked the fence line together, Jack pointing out the posts that had worked loose in the hard-packed earth. He showed her how to check for rot, how to gauge whether a post needed replacing or could be reset. His teaching was patient and thorough, never condescending, always assuming she was capable of understanding. When they found a post that needed work, he dug while she held the post steady, both of them working in tandem without need for constant instruction. "You're strong," Jack observed after they'd reset the third post. It wasn't flirtation, just a statement of fact. "Stronger than you look." "Had to be," Nora said, ramming rocks into the hole around the post base to hold it firm. Being weak was never an option. Jack nodded like he understood. "Elena was like that too, small but tough as rawhide. Used to follow me everywhere when we were kids, insisted on doing everything I did, even though she was half my size." His voice went soft with memory. "She could outcurse any cowhand and outstubborn a mule, right up until the day they broke her." Nora paused in her work, looking at him across the post. "How long did you search for her?" 2 years before I found her. Another year trying to put her back together." Jack's hand stilled on the shovel. "But some things, once they're broken, they don't mend the same. She'd wake up screaming most nights. Couldn't stand to be touched. Couldn't stand to be alone either. It was like watching someone drown in front of you and not being able to reach them." "I'm sorry," Nora said, and meant it with her whole heart. "Yeah, me too." Jack went back to digging. "That's why I brought you here. Not to save you. I'm not fool enough to think I can save anyone, but to give you space to save yourself if you want to." They worked through the morning, the sun climbing higher and the air growing warmer. Jack talked as they walked, pointing out features of the land, where water sometimes gathered after rains, which plants the cattle could eat and which would poison them, where the mountain lions denned in the summer. He spoke about the ranch with a mixture of affection and exasperation, like it was a difficult child he'd adopted and couldn't quite tame. "Previous owner gave up after 3 years," Jack said as they stopped to rest in the shade of a rock outcropping. "Said the land was cursed, too dry, too hard, too mean to support life." He smiled slightly. "I figured that made us a good match." "Do you ever regret it?" Nora asked. "Coming out here, buying this place?" Jack considered the question seriously, his eyes scanning the harsh landscape. "Sometimes," he admitted, "when the well runs low and the cattle die and I haven't seen another human soul in a month. Yeah, sometimes I wonder what the hell I was thinking. But then I remember what I left behind. The pity in people's eyes, the whispers about poor Jack Callahan who couldn't protect his baby sister, the way everyone treated me like I was made of glass about to shatter." He took a long drink from his canteen. "Out here nobody knows me. Nobody expects anything from me. I can just be." "Is that enough?" Nora asked quietly. "Just being?" "Has to be," Jack said, "because it's all any of us really have." They finished the fence work by early afternoon and walked back to the house through heat that shimmered off the desert floor like water. Nora's legs ached and her hands were blistered from the unfamiliar work, but she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. The good kind of tired, the kind that came from honest labor instead of fear. When they reached the house, Jack pointed to a large wooden tub behind the barn. "That's for bathing," he said. "I'll heat water if you want a proper wash. Privacy screens in the barn." The offer of a hot bath was so unexpected that Nora almost cried. She'd been washing from the basin in her room, but a real bath, hot water, privacy, time, felt like an impossible luxury. "I can heat the water myself," she said quickly. "You don't have to—" "I'm heating water anyway for my own bath," Jack interrupted. "Might as well heat enough for 2. No sense wasting fuel." He set about building a fire and filling the large kettle without waiting for her response. Nora stood awkwardly by, wanting to help but not sure what to do. After a moment, Jack glanced at her. "There's soap in the barn," he said, "and some clean cloths for drying. Might as well get them ready." Grateful for a task, Nora went to the barn and found the supplies. The soap was rough and unscented, clearly homemade, but it was real soap, and that was enough. She carried it and the cloths back to where Jack was tending the fire, and together they waited for the water to heat. "I want to thank you," Nora said finally, breaking the silence, "for all of this. The food, the room, the work. I know you said you don't want thanks, but then don't give it," Jack said, not unkindly. "You're working for your keep, like you said you would. We're square." "Are we?" Nora asked, and there was an edge to her voice she hadn't intended. "Because I don't see how mending a few fence posts equals room and board," and she gestured helplessly at the heating water. "And this? Kindness. I don't know how to pay for kindness." Jack was quiet for a long moment, watching the flames. When he spoke, his voice was measured and careful. "When Elena was dying, there was a woman in town. Mrs. Chen ran a laundry. She'd come by every day with soup, with clean sheets, with nothing at all sometimes, just to sit with Elena so she wasn't alone. She didn't ask for payment, didn't want thanks, just showed up, day after day, because she said that's what people do for each other." He looked at Nora. "I asked her once why she bothered. You know what she told me? She said, because someone was kind to me once when I needed it, and the only way to repay that debt is to pass it forward. So that's what I'm doing, passing it forward. You want to pay me back? Be kind to the next person who needs it." Nora felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them away angrily. "You make it sound simple." "It is simple," Jack said. "People make it complicated, but at the core, it's simple. See someone suffering, help if you can, that's all." The water boiled, and Jack helped her pour it into the tub, mixing it with cold well water until it was the right temperature. Then he carried the privacy screen from the barn and set it up, creating a small enclosed space behind the house. "I'll be inside," he said. "Holler if you need anything." He left without looking back, and Nora stood alone with her bath and her complicated feelings. Slowly, she stripped off the blue dress and the undergarments Jack had bought her, folding them carefully despite their dust and sweat. Then she lowered herself into the water and felt her entire body sigh with relief. The heat soaked into her aching muscles, washing away days of grime and the lingering feeling of the auction block's rough wood against her feet. She scrubbed her skin until it was pink, washed her hair twice, let herself float in the simple pleasure of being clean. For those stolen moments, she let herself forget about survival and debt and the complicated arithmetic of kindness. She just was. Like Jack had said, just being. When the water finally cooled, she dried herself with the clean cloths and dressed in the spare dress Jack had included with his supplies. Another simple cotton shift, this one in pale yellow. It fit better than the blue one, and she wondered if he'd somehow guessed her size, or if it was just luck. Her hair was still damp, so she braided it loosely and let it hang over one shoulder. She found Jack in the barn, grooming his horse. He glanced at her briefly, then returned to his work. "Better?" "Yes," Nora said. "Thank you." "Water's still hot if you want to take care of your clothes," Jack said, nodding toward the washing area. "I'll heat more for my turn once you're done." It became a routine over the following days. Morning coffee and breakfast, work until midday, simple lunch, more work, then evening chores and dinner. Jack never asked about her past, never pried into the spaces she kept locked and guarded. Instead, he taught her the rhythms of ranch life, how to feed the chickens and collect eggs without getting pecked, how to milk the 3 scrawny cows that somehow survived in this harsh land, how to check the windmill for problems and prime the pump when it got stubborn. He taught her to shoot, too, taking her out behind the barn with an old rifle and setting up cans on fence posts. "Every woman out here should know how to handle a gun," he said, showing her how to load and aim. "Not because you'll need to shoot anyone, though that's always a possibility, but because knowing you can shoot is different from knowing you can't. Changes how you stand in the world." Nora took to it quickly, her hands steady and her eyes sharp. After an hour of practice, she could hit the cans more often than not. Jack nodded with satisfaction. "You're a natural," he said. "Elena was, too. Could outshoot me by the time she was 15. It was the first time he'd spoken about Elena without the shadow of grief darkening his voice, and Nora felt honored to witness it. Every morning, she found something waiting for her, never announced, never explained, a flower in her windowsill, a piece of honey bread wrapped in cloth by her coffee cup, a smooth river stone, polished by time and water, A carved wooden button that would fit perfectly on her dress where one had torn off. Small things, quiet things, offerings left without ceremony or expectation. At first, Nora didn't know what to make of them. She'd been given gifts before, always with strings attached, always with a price to be paid later. But these seemed to come without demands, placed where she'd find them when she woke like messages from a shy god. She kept them all, arranging them on the small chest in her room like a collection of evidence that kindness existed. On the seventh day, she woke before Jack for the first time and decided to leave something of her own. She had nothing to give, no possessions beyond what he'd bought her, but she could cook. She'd learned that much in her years of survival. How to make a meal from almost nothing, how to coax flavor from simple ingredients through patience and care. She built up the fire carefully, trying not to wake him, and set about making biscuits from flour and lard and a pinch of salt. They weren't fancy, but they were made with attention, and when they came out of the Dutch oven golden and flaky, she felt a small surge of pride. Jack emerged from his room to the smell of fresh baking, his hair still tousled from sleep and his feet bare. He stopped in the doorway, staring at the table where she'd set out the biscuits and fresh coffee. "You didn't have to do this," he said, and his voice was rough with something she couldn't name. "I know," Nora replied, suddenly nervous. "But you've been doing all the cooking, and I wanted to—" She stopped, frustrated by her inability to articulate what the gesture meant. Jack crossed to the table and picked up a biscuit, breaking it open to release a cloud of steam. He took a bite and closed his eyes. "My mother used to make biscuits like this," he said quietly, "before she died. I haven't tasted anything like them in 15 years. "Are they all right?" Nora asked anxiously. "They're perfect," Jack said, and when he opened his eyes, there was a brightness in them that might have been tears. "Thank you, Nora." They ate breakfast together as the sun rose, and something shifted between them, subtle as breath, significant as heartbeat. They were no longer just a man offering shelter and a woman accepting it. They were becoming something else, something that didn't have a name yet, but felt like the beginning of solid ground beneath uncertain feet. The following days brought new gifts. Jack left a book on her windowsill, a collection of poems by Walt Whitman, worn and well-loved. Nora responded by mending a shirt of his she'd noticed had a torn seam, folding it carefully and leaving it on his chair. He brought her a handful of wild sage, fragrant and fresh. She made him a stew that simmered all day, filling the house with warmth and the promise of a good meal. They were learning each other's language, these two broken people, speaking in acts instead of words, building trust the only way it could be built, slowly, carefully, one small gesture at a time. But the desert has its own rhythms, and peace is never guaranteed. On the 10th day, a rider appeared on the horizon during the hottest part of the afternoon. Jack spotted him from where he was working on the corral fence and straightened slowly, his hand moving instinctively to the gun he wore at his hip. Nora, who'd been hanging laundry, felt her heart kick into a faster rhythm. "Get in the house," Jack said quietly, his eyes never leaving the approaching figure. "Jack." "Now, Nora." The command in his voice was undeniable. Nora hurried inside, but she didn't lock herself in her room. Instead, she went to where Jack kept the rifle and loaded it with the ammunition he'd shown her, then positioned herself by the window where she could see out but wouldn't be immediately visible. The rider came closer, resolving into a man on a dusty roan horse. He was young, maybe 25, with a lean build and a face burned dark by the sun. He wore a gun but kept his hands visible as he approached, a small courtesy that suggested he wasn't looking for immediate trouble. Jack waited by the fence, his posture relaxed but ready. "Help you with something?" The rider pulled up about 10 feet away and tipped his hat. "Mr. Callahan, name's Tom Ferris. I work for Mr. Dutch Keller over at the K-Bar Ranch." Inside the house, Nora's hands tightened on the rifle. Dutch Keller, the man who'd wanted to buy her for $3, who'd told Jack he'd regret his choice. "I know who you work for," Jack said, his voice flat. "What's he want?" Tom Ferris shifted in his saddle, uncomfortable. "Mr. Keller sent me to ask about the woman you took from the auction. There's been talk in town, and he wanted me to check that everything's proper." "Proper," Jack repeated, and there was danger in the word. "That's an interesting choice of words. What exactly does Keller think might be improper about a man buying a woman's contract and then freeing her? I'm just delivering the message, sir, Tom said quickly. Mr. Keller wanted to make sure the woman was here of her own free will, that she wasn't being held against her wishes or anything like that. That's real thoughtful of Keller, Jack said with a smile that had no warmth in it. Tell me something, Tom. Was Keller this concerned about free will when he was bidding on her at the auction? Was he planning to ask her wishes before he put her to work in his house? Tom had the grace to look ashamed. I'm just doing what I was told, Mr. Callahan. Then here's what you tell him, Jack said, taking a step closer. You tell him that Nora Hale is a free woman living on my property of her own choice. You tell him she's under my protection, which means anyone who bothers her answers to me. And you tell him that if he's got questions about her welfare, he can ride out here himself and ask them to her face, though I guarantee he won't like her answers. Yes, sir, Tom said. He hesitated, then added, For what it's worth, Mr. Callahan, I think what you did was decent. There's plenty of men in town saying the same. And plenty saying the opposite, I imagine, Jack said dryly. Yes, sir, that too. Tom gathered his reins. I'll deliver your message. You do that, Jack said. And Tom, next time Keller wants to check on someone's welfare, remind him that concern looks a lot more convincing when it comes before the auction block, not after. Tom Ferris rode away, and Jack stood watching until he was out of sight. Only then did he turn back toward the house. Nora was already at the door, the rifle still in her hands. You heard? Jack asked. Every word, Nora confirmed. Sal. She looked at him steadily. You didn't have to defend me like that. Yeah, Jack said. I did. They went back inside, but the peace of the morning felt fractured now, tainted by the reminder that the outside world still existed and still had opinions about how they lived. Jack made coffee while Nora cleaned the rifle and put it back in its place. They sat at the table in silence, the easy companionship of earlier days replaced by a tension neither knew how to address. They'll keep coming, Nora said finally. Men like Keller. They'll want to know what you're getting out of this arrangement. They'll assume things. Let them assume, Jack said, but his jaw was tight. It'll hurt your reputation. People will talk. People always talk, Jack replied. Doesn't make what they say true. But it matters, Nora insisted. Out here, reputation is survival. If people think if they believe we're... She struggled with the words. If they think I'm keeping you like a mistress, Jack finished bluntly, is that what you're worried about? Yes, Nora admitted, because that's what they'll think. A man alone, a woman with no other options. The math is simple for people like Keller. Jack was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee. When he spoke, his voice was careful. Does it bother you? What they might say? It bothers me that it might hurt you, Nora said honestly. You did a good thing, and you shouldn't suffer for it. I'm not suffering, Jack said firmly. And I don't give a damn what Dutch Keller or anyone else thinks about my character. The only person whose opinion matters is yours. So I'm asking you, do you feel safe here? Do you feel free to leave if you wanted to? Yes, Nora said immediately. Then that's all that matters, Jack said. The rest is just noise. But the noise didn't stop. Over the next week, 3 more riders came by at different times, one claiming to be checking if Jack needed help with ranch work, another saying he was looking for a lost calf, the third just happening to be passing through and thought he'd stop for water. Each time, Jack was polite but firm, and each time Nora could see them studying her, measuring her against whatever stories they'd heard in town. The attention made her skin crawl. She'd worked so hard to become invisible, to fade into the background where predators wouldn't notice her. Now she was the subject of gossip and speculation, her name being spoken in saloons by men who thought they had a right to opinions about her life. Maybe I should go, she said one night after the third visitor had left. She and Jack were doing evening chores, and the words came out before she could stop them. Find work in another town, somewhere no one knows about the auction. Jack paused in the middle of forking hay into the horse stalls. Is that what you want? I don't know what I want, Nora admitted. I just know I don't want to be a problem for you. You're not a problem, Jack said. He set down the pitchfork and turned to face her fully. Nora, listen to me. Those men coming by, they're not here out of concern for your welfare or mine. They're here because what we're doing, a man treating a woman like an actual human being with rights and choices, that threatens them. It suggests their way of thinking might be wrong, and people hate nothing more than being told they're wrong. So what do we do? Nora asked. We keep living, Jack said simply. We keep getting up every morning, doing our work, being decent to each other. We don't let them make us ashamed of doing the right thing. Nora wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that simple decency could outlast gossip and judgment. But she'd learned the hard way that the world rarely rewarded virtue, and good intentions were no match for determined cruelty. That night she lay in her bed with her door bolted and listened to the sounds of the desert through her window. An owl called somewhere in the darkness. The windmill creaked, and from the main room she could hear Jack moving around, restless and unable to sleep. She thought about the gifts he'd left her every morning, the flowers and stones and small kindnesses. She thought about how he'd taught her to shoot, how he'd defended her to Tom Ferris, how he'd asked if she felt free rather than telling her she should be grateful. She thought about his sister Elena and the promise he'd made to be on time just once. And she made a decision. The next morning she woke before dawn and went to Jack's door, knocking softly. He answered quickly, already dressed, as if he'd been awake for hours. Something wrong? He asked immediately. No, Nora said. I just wanted to say, I'm not going anywhere. Whatever they say in town, whatever trouble comes from this, I'm staying. If you'll have me. Jack studied her face in the dim lamplight. You're sure? I'm sure, Nora said, and felt the truth of it settle into her bones. For the first time in years, I'm exactly where I choose to be, and that's worth fighting for. Something shifted in Jack's expression, relief, maybe, or recognition. Then we'll fight together, he said. But first we'll have coffee. Always coffee first. They went to the kitchen together, and Jack poured 2 cups while Nora started breakfast. As the sun rose over the desert, painting the world in shades of gold and promise, they began another day of the life they were building, fragile and uncertain, but theirs. And on Nora's windowsill, a fresh chrysanthemum waited in its tin cup, yellow and bright as hope. The chrysanthemum had barely begun to wilt when everything changed. It happened on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Nora had declared her intention to stay. She'd fallen into the rhythms of ranch life so completely that she sometimes forgot there had ever been a before. Forgot the auction block, the ropes, the faces of men who'd measured her worth in dollars. The memories were still there, lurking in the dark corners of her mind, but they'd lost some of their teeth. Here, in the clean desert air with work to occupy her hands and Jack's steady presence to anchor her days, she'd begun to believe that maybe the past could stay buried. She should have known better. They were in town that morning, making the monthly supply run. Jack had been reluctant to bring her at first, worried about the gossip and the stares, but Nora had insisted. She refused to hide like she'd done something wrong, refused to let Dutch Keller and his kind dictate where she could go. Besides, she'd argued, she needed to learn the route and the suppliers if she was going to be any real help managing the ranch. Jack had agreed, though his jaw had been tight as they rode into Salvation Creek, and Nora noticed he kept his horse positioned slightly between her and the buildings, like a living shield. The town looked different in daylight, less threatening without the crowd and the auction block. Just a collection of sun-bleached buildings and dusty streets, ordinary and forgettable. They tied their horses outside Pritchard's general store, and Jack held the door open for her, his eyes scanning the street one last time before following her inside. Abel Pritchard was behind the counter, sorting through a shipment of canned goods. He looked up when they entered, and something flickered across his face. Recognition, calculation, discomfort. He settled on a professional smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Callahan," he said with a nod. "Miss Hale, is it?" "Just Nora," she said, meeting his gaze directly. She'd learned that trick from Jack. Look people in the eye, don't apologize for existing, make them uncomfortable with their own judgment. "Right, Nora." Pritchard wiped his hands on his apron. "What can I do for you folks today?" Jack pulled out a list from his shirt pocket. "Need the usual supplies: flour, sugar, coffee, salt, some ammunition for the rifle, lamp oil, and whatever fabric you've got that might work for winter clothes. Going to be a cold season, I think." While Pritchard gathered the items, Nora wandered the store, running her fingers over bolts of cloth and jars of preserved fruit. There was a simplicity to it that pleased her. The straightforward exchange of money for goods, no hidden prices, no debts that came due in blood and shame. She was so absorbed in examining a bolt of dark wool that she almost didn't hear the door open behind her. Almost. But years of survival had given her instincts that were hard to unlearn, and she turned just as a woman's voice said, "Well, well, if it isn't the dollar girl." The speaker was perhaps 40, dressed in a dark green dress that had seen better days but was still respectable. Her face was hard and lined, her eyes carrying the particular cruelty of someone who'd suffered and decided everyone else should suffer too. Behind her stood two other women, younger but cut from the same cloth, their expressions eager and mean. "Mrs. Havens," Pritchard said quickly, nervously. "Good morning. I'll be with you shortly, just finishing up with—" "I can wait," Mrs. Havens said, her eyes never leaving Nora. "I'm in no hurry, though I am curious about what brings our local charity case into town. Surely Mr. Callahan hasn't spent all his money on you already." Nora felt her spine stiffen, but she kept her voice level. "We're buying supplies, same as anyone." "Supplies?" Havens repeated, her mouth twisting. "Is that what they're calling it now?" She looked at her companions, who tittered dutifully. "And I suppose you're paying with honest money? Not with whatever services you're providing out at that ranch?" The implication was clear and ugly. Nora felt heat rise in her cheeks, but before she could respond, Jack was there, moving between her and Mrs. Havens with the controlled grace of a man who knew exactly how dangerous he could be. "Careful," he said quietly, and the single word carried more threat than a shouted curse. "You're about to say something you can't take back." Mrs. Havens faltered for a moment, but she'd committed to her cruelty and couldn't back down without losing face. "I'm just saying what everyone's thinking, Mr. Callahan. You take in this woman, and suddenly you're playing house like respectable people. But we all know what she is. We saw her on that auction block, saw how she—" "You saw a woman being sold like cattle," Jack interrupted, his voice hard as stone. "And you did nothing to stop it. So before you start judging her character, maybe take a look at your own." "How dare you?" Mrs. Havens gasped. "I am a respectable woman, a pillar of this community." "You're a woman who watched another woman's humiliation and did nothing," Jack said flatly. "That's all you are to me." The store had gone deathly quiet. Pritchard stood frozen behind his counter, clearly wishing he was anywhere else. The two women with Mrs. Havens had stopped tittering, their faces uncertain, and Nora stood with her hands clenched at her sides, torn between gratitude for Jack's defense and shame that he had to make it. Mrs. Havens drew herself up, her face flushed with outrage. "The church will hear about this. The town council. You mark my words, Callahan. You and your whore will regret." Jack moved so fast that Nora barely saw it. One moment he was standing still, the next he was inches from Mrs. Havens, towering over her, and the woman actually stumbled backward in fear. "Get out," Jack said, his voice low and absolutely terrifying. "Get out of this store right now before I forget I was raised not to lay hands on women, no matter how much they deserve it." Mrs. Havens fled, her companions scrambling after her. The door slammed behind them with enough force to make the jars on the shelves rattle. In the aftermath, the silence was crushing. Pritchard cleared his throat nervously. I'll just total up your supplies, Mr. Callahan." "You do that," Jack said, his voice still hard. He turned to Nora. "You all right?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. What she wanted to say was thank you, and I'm sorry, and why do you keep fighting for me, but all of it tangled up in her throat and came out as nothing. They finished their business in painful quiet, Pritchard practically throwing their goods into bags in his hurry to be done with them. Jack paid in cash, counting out the exact amount, and they carried their supplies outside to where the horses waited. As Jack was securing the bags to his saddle, Nora finally found her voice. "You didn't have to do that." "Yeah," Jack said, not looking at her. "I did." "She'll make trouble for you now. For us. You heard what she said about the church and the council." "Let her." Jack tested the knots on the supply bags, his movements sharp with barely controlled anger. "I'm done pretending that people like her deserve respect just because they show up to church on Sunday and pretend to be decent." They're not decent. They're just good at hiding their cruelty behind manners and morality. Jack, she called you a whore, Jack said, and now he did look at her, his eyes blazing. In public, to your face. You think I was going to stand there and let that happen? You think I bought your freedom just to let people drag you through the mud anyway? I can fight my own battles, Nora said, though even as she said it, she wasn't sure it was true. She'd been fighting so long that she was tired down to her bones, and having someone stand beside her felt both wonderful and terrifying. I know you can, Jack said, his voice gentling slightly. But you don't have to, not anymore, not alone. They stood there in the dusty street, the morning sun beating down, the town watching through windows and doorways. Nora felt exposed, vulnerable, like she was back on the auction block being measured and judged. But this time, she wasn't alone. This time, someone had chosen to stand with her instead of against her. We should go, she said finally, before this gets worse. Jack nodded and helped her mount her horse. As they turned to leave, a voice called out from the saloon across the street, Callahan! Dutch Keller stood on the saloon's porch, a glass of whiskey in one hand despite the early hour. He was grinning, but there was nothing friendly in it. Heard you made quite a scene in Pritchard's store. Mrs. Havens came running over here near tears, saying you threatened her. I didn't threaten her, Jack said calmly, though his hand rested on his hip near his gun. I told her the truth. If that hurt her feelings, that's her problem. Mighty protective of your investment, aren't you? Dutch took a swig of whiskey. Or maybe there's more to this arrangement than you've been letting on. Go home, Dutch, Jack said. Sleep off whatever you're drinking and leave us alone. I'm just asking questions, Dutch said, all false innocence. Questions the whole town wants answers to. What exactly does that girl do to earn her keep out at your ranch? Must be something special to make a man abandon all his sense and decency. Nora felt Jack tense beside her, felt the air go electric with potential violence. She put a hand on his arm, squeezing gently. Don't, she said quietly. He's trying to provoke you. Don't give him what he wants. Jack looked at her, then back at Dutch. For a long moment, the street held its breath, waiting to see which way the storm would break. Then Jack deliberately turned his horse away from the saloon, away from Dutch Keller and his poison. Let's go home, he said to Nora. They rode out of Salvation Creek with eyes following them and whispers trailing behind like dust. Neither of them spoke until the town was nothing but a dark smudge on the horizon behind them. Only then did Jack finally break the silence. I'm sorry, he said. I'm sorry you had to hear that. I'm sorry I can't protect you from their ugliness. You did protect me, Nora said. You stood up for me when no one else would. Fat lot of good it did, Jack said bitterly. Now they'll be worse. They'll make both our lives hell. And for what? Because I couldn't keep my mouth shut? Because you did the right thing, Nora corrected. Don't apologize for that. They rode in silence for another mile before Nora spoke again, her voice hesitant. Jack, can I ask you something? Anything. That night, when you found me on the auction block, you said you already regretted waiting so long. She paused, gathering courage. What did you mean by that? Jack was quiet for so long that Nora thought he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly, like he was choosing each one with care. I'd been in town earlier that day, he said. Saw the notices about the auction, saw your name on the list. I almost rode out then, almost left before it started because I knew what it would be. Men treating human beings like livestock, convinced they had the right because the law said so. He shifted in his saddle. But I told myself it wasn't my business. Told myself I couldn't save everyone. And I almost left you there because I was too much of a coward to face my own failures. But you came back, Nora said. I got about a mile out of town before I had to stop, Jack continued. Sat there on my horse, thinking about Elena. Thinking about all the times I told myself something wasn't my business, wasn't my fight. And I realized that every time I'd said that, I'd been wrong. Everything is our business when it comes to basic human decency. Every fight against cruelty is our fight. He looked at her. So when I said I regretted waiting, I meant I regretted every moment I'd spent talking myself out of being the kind of man I wanted to be, the kind of man Elena deserved to have for a brother. Nora felt tears sting her eyes. She would have been proud of you. Maybe, Jack said, or maybe she would have said it was about damn time. When they reached the ranch, they unloaded the supplies in silence, each absorbed in their own thoughts. The confrontation in town had shaken something loose between them, exposed feelings that had been growing in the quiet spaces of morning coffee and evening chores. But neither knew how to name those feelings, or what to do with them now that they'd been dragged into the light. That night, Nora lay in her bed and stared at the ceiling, listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling. She thought about Mrs. Havens's cruel words, about Dutch Keller's insinuations, about the way Jack had stood between her and their judgment without hesitation. She thought about the gifts he left her each morning, about his patient teaching and careful kindness, about the way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she wasn't watching, like she was something precious and breakable that he was terrified of damaging. And she thought about what people would say if they knew the truth, that she was falling in love with him, that she lay awake at night listening for his footsteps, hoping he might knock on her door, that the happiest parts of her day were the quiet moments they shared over coffee before dawn, when the world was still sleeping and they could just be two people existing in the same gentle space. It was foolish. It was dangerous. She had no right to these feelings, no right to want more than the safety and kindness he'd already given her. Jack had made no promises beyond shelter and protection, had never suggested he wanted anything from her except honest work and the chance to pay forward a debt he owed to his sister's memory. But the heart has never been good at respecting what's wise or proper, and Nora's heart, battered and scarred as it was, had decided to risk hoping again. She must have eventually slept, because she woke to the sound of something that didn't belong to the usual nighttime symphony of the desert. A horse, moving fast, coming closer. Then voices. Jack's, sharp and alert, and another she didn't recognize. Nora was out of bed and at her door in seconds, the knife she still kept under her pillow gripped tight in one hand. Through the crack, she could see lamplight in the main room and shadows moving. Jack was talking to someone, his voice low and urgent. She eased the door open and stepped into the main room. Jack stood by the table with a man she'd never seen before, young, dust-covered, his face tight with fear and exhaustion. "Don't know where else to go," the stranger was saying. "They've been tracking her for 3 days. I managed to lose them in the canyon, but they'll pick up the trail again come morning." "How many?" Jack asked. 4, maybe 5, hard to tell in the dark. The man finally noticed Nora standing in her doorway. "Sorry, ma'am, didn't mean to wake you." "What's happening?" Nora asked, moving closer. Jack's face was grim. "This is Charlie Moss. He's running from bounty hunters with a girl they're trying to take back to a brothel in Tucson. He needs help." Nora's blood went cold. "Where is she?" "Outside," Charlie said. "I didn't want to bring her in without permission. She's just a kid, barely 16. They took her from her family 6 months ago, been passing her around the territory ever since. I worked security at the last place, saw what they were doing to her, couldn't stand by anymore." It was Elena's story all over again. It was Nora's story. It was every woman's story in a world where men thought bodies could be bought and sold like grain or cattle. Nora looked at Jack and saw her own horror reflected in his eyes. "Bring her in," Jack said without hesitation. "Bring her in right now." Charlie hurried outside and returned moments later half carrying a small figure wrapped in a blanket. The girl was barely conscious, her face bruised and swollen, her hair matted with blood and dirt. She couldn't have weighed more than 90 pounds, and most of that was fear and bones. Nora's training from her own years of survival kicked in immediately. "Put her on my bed," she said, leading the way to her room. "Charlie, heat water. Jack, I need clean cloths and whatever medical supplies you have." They moved with purpose, each knowing their role without needing instruction. Nora began cleaning the girl's wounds as gently as she could, murmuring reassurances even though the girl seemed beyond hearing them. The damage was extensive, bruises in various stages of healing, cuts that had been left to fester, burns that made Nora's stomach turn. "Her name's Sarah," Charlie said from the doorway, his voice thick. "Sarah Chen. Her mother's Chinese, father was a prospector. They took her from a mining camp, said she was vagrant property after her father died and her mother couldn't pay their debts." Mrs. Chen, the woman who'd been kind to Elena. This was her daughter. Jack met Nora's eyes across the bed, and she knew he'd made the same connection. The debt was coming full circle, the kindness being passed forward just like Mrs. Chen had told him to do. "They can't have her," Nora said fiercely, cleaning blood from Sarah's face with careful hands. "I don't care how many of them there are or what law they're hiding behind. They can't have her." "Agreed," Jack said, "but we need a plan. If they track her here, when they track her here," Charlie corrected grimly. "These aren't amateurs, they're professional bounty hunters, and they've got a contract that says they can retrieve her. The law is on their side." "Then we'll have to be smarter than the law," Jack said. They worked through the night. While Nora tended to Sarah's wounds and coaxed her to drink water with honey dissolved in it, Jack and Charlie barricaded the doors and checked ammunition. They moved furniture to create defensive positions, made sure the horses were fed and ready in case they needed to run, filled every container they had with water. As dawn approached, Sarah finally surfaced from whatever dark place her mind had retreated to. Her eyes opened, brown and young and full of terror, and she tried to scramble away from Nora, clearly expecting more pain. "Shh," Nora said softly, keeping her distance. "You're safe. Nobody here is going to hurt you." "Where am I?" Sarah's voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "My ranch," Jack said from the doorway. "About 15 miles west of Salvation Creek. Charlie brought you here. You remember Charlie?" Sarah's eyes found Charlie, and some of the terror eased. "You came back for me." "Told you I would," Charlie said, his voice rough with emotion. "Told you I'd get you somewhere safe." "They'll come," Sarah said, and started to cry. Silent tears that spoke of someone who'd learned that sobbing brought punishment. "They always come. They always find me." "Let them come," Nora said, and her voice carried the weight of every indignity she'd ever suffered, every moment of helplessness she'd endured. "Let them come, and they'll find out what happens when women stop being prey." Jack looked at her, and something passed between them. Recognition and resolution, and the understanding that some lines, once crossed, changed everything. This was their line. This was where they stood. The bounty hunters arrived at mid-morning, riding in with the confidence of men who'd never been told no in their lives. There were 5 of them, just like Charlie had estimated. Hard men with hard eyes and guns worn easy at their hips. The leader was a bull of a man with a scarred face and a smile that made Nora think of wolves. They stopped in the yard, making no effort to hide their presence. The leader, his name they'd later learn, was Pike, called out in a voice that carried across the morning stillness. "We know you're in there, Callahan. We know you've got the Chen girl. Send her out and we'll be on our way. No trouble, no violence, just give us what we came for." Jack stepped out onto the porch, his rifle held casual but ready. "That's so. And what exactly did you come for?" "You know what?" Pike said, his smile widening. "The girl. She's property of the Scarlet Rose in Tucson. We've got papers that say so. You're interfering with a legal recovery." "Legal," Jack said, tasting the word like poison. "That's an interesting way to describe kidnapping." "She's indentured," Pike said, losing his smile. "Her mother signed the contract when she couldn't pay her debts. All legal and proper. Now stop wasting our time and send her out." "No," Jack said simply. Pike's hand moved toward his gun, and suddenly there were 5 more rifles pointing at him from strategic positions around the ranch. Nora from the barn, Charlie from behind the water trough, and 3 ranch hands who'd appeared from nowhere, men Jack had clearly called in during the night. "You're outnumbered," Jack said conversationally, "and outgunned. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to ride away from my property and forget you ever heard the name Sarah Chen. You're going to go back to Tucson and tell whoever hired you that she died. Disease, accident, whatever story works, and in return, I won't put a bullet in each of you and bury you in the desert where no one will ever find you." "You can't," Pike started. "I can," Jack interrupted, "and I will. See, I've got a problem with men who hunt children for money. It offends me on a real deep level, so deep that I'm willing to become a murderer to stop it. Are you willing to die for your paycheck?" The standoff stretched out, tension thick enough to choke on. Pike looked around at the rifles pointed at him and his men, calculating odds and finding them poor. Finally, he spat in the dirt. "This isn't over," he said. "Yeah, it is," Jack replied. "You just don't know it yet." The bounty hunters rode away, but everyone knew they'd be back. with more men, with the law, with whatever force they could muster. Jack had bought them time, nothing more. That night, as they sat around the table planning their next move, Sarah spoke for the first time since the confrontation. "I should leave," she said, her voice small but steady. "I should go, and then they'll leave you alone." "No," Nora said immediately. "That's what they want. They want you isolated, alone, easy to take. That's how they win." "But I can't," Sarah's voice cracked. "I can't let you fight my battles. I can't let you get hurt because of me." Nora reached across the table and took the girl's hand, holding it gently but firmly. "Listen to me, Sarah. For years, I fought alone. For years, I thought I had to carry everything myself because no one else cared. And you know what that got me? It got me on an auction block, getting sold for $1. She squeezed Sarah's hand. But then this stubborn, impossible man decided my fight was his fight too. He decided that basic decency meant standing up even when it was dangerous, even when it was inconvenient. And because of him, I'm here. I'm free. I'm alive. She looked at Jack. "So now it's my turn to pass it forward. Your fight is my fight, Sarah, and we don't leave people behind." Sarah started to cry again, but this time the tears were different, the kind that came from hope instead of despair. Charlie put an arm around her shoulders, and Jack poured coffee for everyone, and they sat together in the lamplight, making plans to fight against a system that considered them criminals for choosing mercy over law. Outside, the desert night stretched endlessly in all directions, vast and unforgiving and beautiful in its honesty. And inside a small adobe ranch house, 5 people who'd been broken by the world began the work of putting each other back together, one small act of defiance at a time. It wasn't redemption yet, it wasn't victory, but it was something, a line drawn in the sand, a choice made, a promise kept. And sometimes, in the harsh arithmetic of survival, that was enough to tip the balance from despair toward hope. The morning would bring new challenges, new dangers. But for now, they had this moment, this small circle of light against the darkness, and they would defend it with everything they had. The 3 ranch hands Jack had called in stayed for 2 days, keeping watch while Jack and Charlie made plans. Their names were Miguel, Tom Yates, and an older man everyone called Preacher, though he'd never seen the inside of a seminary. They were good men who'd worked for Jack before, men who understood that some debts couldn't be paid in cash, and some fights were worth having even when the odds were terrible. On the 3rd morning, Miguel rode out before dawn with a message for the marshal in the next county over, a man Jack knew from his Texas days, someone who might be willing to bend the law toward justice instead of profit. Tom Yates took Sarah's description and headed south toward the Mexican border, where he had connections with families who specialized in helping people disappear. And Preacher stayed behind to help fortify the ranch and teach Nora things she'd never thought she'd need to know. "You ever kill a man?" Preacher asked her as they stood behind the barn, the morning sun just starting to burn off the night's chill. Nora looked at the rifle in her hands, then at the old man's weathered face. "No." "Think you could if you had to?" She thought about Sarah's bruises, about Elena's broken spirit, about the auction block and the men who'd laughed while bidding on her body. "Yes," she said, and meant it. Preacher nodded like she'd passed some test. "Good, because pretty soon you might have to make that choice for real. Pike and his boys, they're not going to let this go. They'll come back, and when they do, they'll come hard. You need to be ready." He spent the morning teaching her things Jack hadn't covered, how to shoot to kill instead of just to scare, how to reload fast under pressure, how to use cover and concealment, how to stay calm when adrenaline was screaming through her veins. It was brutal, practical education, the kind that left no room for hesitation or mercy. By noon, Nora's shoulders ached and her ears rang from the gunfire, but she could hit a man-sized target at 50 yards without having to think about it. Preacher seemed satisfied. "You'll do," he said, cleaning his own rifle with practiced efficiency. "Just remember, if it comes down to shooting, you don't aim to wound. You don't shoot to warn. You shoot to stop. Understand?" "I understand," Nora said, and felt something cold and hard settle in her chest. She'd spent so long trying to survive without violence, trying to stay small and invisible and harmless. But there was a difference between being harmless and being defenseless, and she was done being defenseless. Inside the house, Sarah was learning her own lessons. Jack had given her one of his old shirts and a pair of canvas pants that had to be rolled up at the cuffs, and with her hair cut short by Nora's careful scissors, she looked like a young boy instead of a hunted girl. It was a disguise that might buy them time if the bounty hunters came looking. "I don't recognize myself," Sarah said, staring at her reflection in the small mirror Nora had brought her. "Good," Nora replied, braiding her own hair tight against her skull. "That's the point. You're not that girl anymore, the one they took, the one they hurt. You're someone new, someone they can't touch." "Is that what you did?" Sarah asked quietly. "When you were on the auction block? Did you become someone new?" Nora paused in her braiding, considering the question. "I tried to," she admitted. "I tried to build walls so high that nothing could hurt me anymore. But you know what I learned? You can't wall yourself off from pain without also walling yourself off from everything else. From joy, from connection, from the chance to be loved." She looked at Sarah. "So maybe the trick isn't to become someone new. Maybe it's to remember who you were before they tried to break you and fight like hell to get that person back." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "I don't remember who I was before. It feels like 100 years ago." "Then we'll help you remember," Nora said firmly. "One day at a time, one moment of safety at a time, until the before becomes now." Charlie appeared in the doorway, his face grim. "Rider coming, fast." Everyone moved with the efficiency of drilled soldiers. Sarah was bundled into the root cellar beneath the kitchen, a space Jack had expanded and stocked with water and supplies. Nora took her position in the barn loft with a clear line of sight to the yard. Jack and Charlie positioned themselves on the porch with rifles ready, and Preacher climbed onto the roof where he'd set up a sniper's nest behind the chimney. But the rider who thundered into the yard wasn't Pike or his bounty hunters. It was Tom Yates, returning much sooner than expected, and the expression on his face made Nora's stomach clench with dread. "They're coming!" Tom shouted, sliding off his horse before it had fully stopped. "Pike and his crew, plus 6 more men he picked up in Tucson. They'll be here by nightfall, maybe sooner." Jack's jaw tightened. "You sure?" "Ran into them on the road south. They didn't recognize me, but I heard them talking. They've got papers signed by a judge in Tucson. Says they can search any property and take Sarah by force if necessary. They're calling it a lawful recovery of stolen property." Tom spat in the dust. "And they're bringing enough firepower to start a small war. 12 men against 5, with the law on their side and no cavalry coming to the rescue." The mathematics were brutal and unavoidable. Jack looked at Charlie, at Preacher, at Tom, and finally at Nora watching from the barn loft. "We can't win this fight," he said quietly. "Not straight up. So we're not going to fight it." "What are you saying?" Charlie asked, his hand tightening on his rifle. "I'm saying we're smarter than they are," Jack replied, "and we're going to use that. Charlie, can you handle a wagon?" "Of course I can." "Then here's what we're going to do." The plan Jack outlined was audacious and dangerous and absolutely insane, which meant it might actually work. While Tom rode to spread word among the scattered ranches that a group of armed men were heading this way illegally, Charlie would take Sarah and drive a wagon west toward California, using back trails that Pike wouldn't know about. Meanwhile, Jack, Nora, and Preacher would stay behind to make Pike think Sarah was still here, buying Charlie as much time as possible. "That's suicide," Nora said flatly, climbing down from the loft. "You're going to face down 12 armed men and just... what? Talk them to death?" "No," Jack said. "I'm going to make them so mad they forget to think straight. Make them waste time searching the ranch, arguing, threatening. Every minute they spend here is another mile between them and Sarah. And when they realize she's gone, when they realize you've been lying to them..." Nora felt panic rising in her throat. "They'll kill you, Jack. They'll kill all of you." "Maybe," Jack admitted, "but Sarah will be safe. That's what matters." "No," Nora said, her voice sharp. "That's not all that matters. You matter. Your life matters. You can't just throw it away because..." "Because what?" Jack asked gently. "Because I've got so much to live for? This ranch that barely survives? This life where I spend my days alone trying to forget my failures?" He shook his head. "Sarah's 16 years old, Nora. She's got her whole life ahead of her. That's worth protecting." "So do you," Nora said desperately. "You've got your whole life ahead of you, too. You can't..." She stopped, unable to articulate the tangle of feelings choking her words. Jack studied her face for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression. Surprise, maybe, or realization. Nora, no, she's right, Preacher interrupted. This plan's got more holes than a screen door. We need a better way. They argued through the afternoon, discarding plans as fast as they made them. Send everyone away and let Pike search an empty ranch? He'd just track them all. Make a stand and fight? They'd be slaughtered. Try to negotiate? Pike had the law on his side and no reason to compromise. Finally, as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Nora spoke up with an idea so crazy it stunned everyone into silence. What if we give Pike what he wants? She said slowly. We're not handing over Sarah, Charlie said immediately. No, Nora agreed. But Pike doesn't know what Sarah looks like anymore, does he? He's got a description from 6 months ago. Long black hair, pale skin, about 5 feet tall. But that description could fit a lot of girls out here. Jack's eyes widened as he understood where she was going. Nora, no. Why not? She met his gaze steadily. I've got dark hair. I'm the right height. Put me in the right clothes, mess up my face a little, and I could pass for her in the dark. Pike takes me, thinks he's got his bounty, and by the time he realizes his mistake, Sarah's in California and you've got time to get the real law involved. Absolutely not, Jack said flatly. I didn't buy your freedom just to let you trade it for someone else's. You're not letting me do anything, Nora said, her voice hard. I'm choosing this. Just like you chose to pay $1 for a stranger's contract. Just like you're choosing to risk your life for Sarah. I'm making the same choice, Jack. Don't take that away from me. She's got a point, Preacher said reluctantly. It might actually work. No, Jack repeated, but there was desperation in his voice now. There has to be another way. There isn't, Nora said gently. You know there isn't. Pike's coming tonight, and we're out of time and options. She moved closer to him, looking up into his face. This is my choice. My fight. Let me fight it. Jack looked at her like she was killing him, like every word was a knife between his ribs. Do you have any idea what they'll do to you when they figure out you're not Sarah? When they realize we tricked them? I have some idea, yeah, Nora said, and her voice only shook a little. But here's what I also know. Sarah gets to live. She gets to be free. And maybe, if you're half as smart and stubborn as I think you are, you'll figure out how to come get me before it's too late. Nora shit. I spent years being helpless, she interrupted. Years letting things happen to me because I didn't have the power to stop them. But this is me choosing. This is me having power. Don't take that away from me just because you're afraid. The silence that followed was devastating. Jack's hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, his jaw working like he was grinding down arguments between his teeth. Finally, he turned away, his shoulders tight with tension. Fine, he said, and the word was broken glass. But we do it my way. You wear a wire under your clothes so we can track you. You carry a knife where you can reach it, and you remember every landmark, every turn, every detail you can, because I swear to God, Nora, I will come for you. Even if I have to tear down every brothel between here and Mexico, I will come for you. I know, Nora said softly. I'm counting on it. They spent the remaining hours preparing. Charlie helped Sarah into the wagon and covered her with supplies, creating a hiding space that would pass casual inspection. Tom rode out to position himself on the trail, ready to lead Pike away from Charlie's route if necessary. And Preacher worked with Nora, showing her how to leave signs that a tracker could follow, torn bits of cloth, marks in the dirt, subtle signals that wouldn't alert her captors but would guide a rescue. Jack barely spoke during the preparations, his face carved from stone, his movements precise and controlled. But when Charlie was ready to leave and Sarah emerged from her hiding place to say goodbye, he pulled the girl into a brief, fierce hug. You be good, he said roughly. You stay safe. And you remember, none of this is your fault. You hear me? None of it. Sarah nodded, crying, and Charlie lifted her gently into the wagon. As they drove away into the gathering dusk, Nora watched Jack's face and saw the ghost that haunted him. Elena, leaving for the last time, waving from a wagon he'd never see again. This is different, she said quietly. Sarah's going to make it. She's going to be all right. Yeah, Jack said, but he didn't sound convinced. Pike and his men arrived as the last light was fading from the sky. They came in loud, confident, 12 riders with torches and guns, and the absolute certainty that the law was on their side. Pike himself led them into the yard, his scarred face twisted in a grin. "Evening, Callahan," he called out. "We've come for the Chen girl. Hand her over, and we'll be on our way." Jack stepped onto the porch, his rifle cradled in his arms. "She's not here. She ran off 2 days ago, headed for the border. You're wasting your time." "Now, that's funny," Pike said, his grin widening. "Because we heard from some folks in town that you've had visitors, that you're hiding someone. So why don't you save us all some trouble and bring her out?" "I told you," Jack said coldly. "She's not here, but you're welcome to search the property if you don't believe me." Pike's eyes narrowed. "You giving us permission to search?" "I'm inviting you to try," Jack replied. "But you should know. I've got 3 rifles trained on you right now from positions you can't see. You make one wrong move, and you'll be dead before you hit the ground." It was a calculated gamble, using their fear and uncertainty against them. Pike's men shifted nervously, hands moving toward weapons, eyes scanning the darkening landscape for hidden threats. Pike himself looked less confident than he had a moment ago. "We've got papers," he said, pulling a document from his coat. "Signed by Judge Harrison in Tucson. Says we have legal authority to search any property and recover stolen goods. You interfere, you're breaking the law." "Then I guess we're both outlaws now," Jack said. "So here's how this is going to work. You can search the house and the barn. You can look in every room, every corner, every hiding place you can think of. But you do it one at a time, unarmed, while the rest of your men stay in the yard where I can see them. Those are my terms. Take them or leave." Pike considered this, clearly trying to figure out the angle. Finally, he nodded. "Fine. But if we find her—" "You won't," Jack said. But of course they did. Because Nora had positioned herself exactly where they'd find her. In the barn loft, huddled in the shadows, wearing Sarah's torn dress from when she'd arrived. When Pike's man called down that he'd found something, Nora let herself be dragged into the yard, struggling just enough to look helpless, but not enough to actually escape. Pike grabbed her chin roughly, turning her face toward the torchlight. She'd rubbed dirt into her skin and tangled her hair, and in the flickering shadows she could pass for a scared 16-year-old girl. "This her?" Pike asked his men. "Looks about right," one of them said. "Hard to tell in this light." "Please," Nora whimpered, making her voice higher, younger. "Please don't take me back. I'll die there. Please." "Shut up," Pike said, but there was satisfaction in his voice. He'd gotten what he came for, or thought he had. He turned to Jack. "We're taking her. You try to stop us. We'll shoot you where you stand. Understand?" Jack's face was a mask of controlled rage, and Nora knew with absolute certainty, that he was calculating whether he could kill all 12 men before they killed him. She caught his eye and shook her head slightly. "Not yet. Not now. Trust the plan." "You got a bill of sale for her?" Jack asked, his voice tight. "Don't need one," Pike said. "We've got papers saying she's property of the Scarlet Rose. That's all the authority we need." "Then I guess I can't stop you," Jack said, and Nora heard what the words cost him. "But you remember this, Pike. There's a difference between legal and right, and someday you're going to have to answer for which side you chose." "I'll sleep just fine," Pike said, shoving Nora toward his horse. "Now clear out before I decide to arrest you for obstruction." They tied Nora's hands and lifted her onto a horse behind one of Pike's men, and she used those few seconds to meet Jack's eyes one last time. "Don't be stupid," she tried to say without words. "Don't get yourself killed. Come find me, but come smart." His eyes said, "I will burn the world to get you back." Then they were riding away into the darkness, and Nora had to focus on the plan, memorizing landmarks, feeling for the thin wire Jack had sewn into her dress seam, counting turns and estimating distances. Behind her, the ranch disappeared into the night, and she was alone again with dangerous men and the desperate hope that she'd bought Sarah enough time to get away. They rode for hours, stopping only once to water the horses. Pike's men were celebrating their easy victory, passing a bottle of whiskey between them and making crude jokes about what would happen when they delivered their prize to Tucson. Nora kept her head down and her mouth shut, playing the role of terrified victim while her mind worked through possibilities and probabilities. It was past midnight when they finally made camp in a canyon that offered protection from the wind. Pike posted 2 guards and let the rest of his men collapse into exhausted sleep. Nora was tied to a tree at the edge of camp, close enough to be watched, but far enough that she couldn't hear their conversation. She waited until the camp had settled, until the only sounds were snoring and the crackle of the dying fire. Then she began working on the ropes around her wrists, using a technique Preacher had taught her, not trying to break free, just loosening them enough that she could slip out if she needed to run. It was slow, painful work that left her wrists raw and bleeding, but by the time the sky began to lighten in the east, she'd created just enough slack. Dawn brought a new problem. Pike woke early and came to check on his prisoner, and in the clear morning light he studied her face with narrowing eyes. "How old are you?" he asked abruptly. Nora kept her voice small and scared. 16. "I told you." "Yeah, you told me," Pike said slowly. "But you don't look 16, you look older. And your hands—" He grabbed her wrist, studying the calluses and scars. "These aren't the hands of some brothel girl. These are working hands." Nora's heart kicked into overdrive, but she kept her face blank. "They made me work, cleaning, cooking. That's how I got these." Pike wasn't buying it. He turned to his men, who were starting to wake and take notice. "Something's wrong here. This isn't the Chen girl." "What are you talking about?" one of the men asked. "You said she matched the description." "In the dark, maybe," Pike said. "But look at her. She's too old, too worn. Chen girl was supposed to be soft, fresh. This one's been through hell." His eyes went cold and calculating. "I think Callahan played us. I think this is a decoy." The camp exploded into chaos. Men shouting, weapons being checked, horses being saddled. Pike grabbed Nora by the throat, lifting her half off the ground. "Where is she?" he snarled. "Where's the real Chen girl?" Nora smiled through the choking pressure on her windpipe. "California by now, I'd guess. Or maybe Mexico. Either way, somewhere you'll never find her." Pike's fist crashed into her face, and the world went white with pain. She tasted blood, felt her lips split, but she kept smiling because Sarah was safe, and that was all that mattered. "You think this is funny?" Pike was screaming now, hitting her again. "You think you can make a fool of me? I'll kill you. I'll kill Callahan. I'll kill everyone who helped you." "Get in line," Nora spat blood at his feet. "Plenty of men have wanted to kill me. I'm still here." Pike raised his fist again, but one of his men grabbed his arm. "Boss, we need to move. If she's telling the truth, Chen's got a full day's head start. And Callahan's probably coming after this one. We need to either use her as bait or cut our losses." Pike's face was purple with rage, but he was smart enough to see the logic. "Fine. We take her back toward the ranch, set up an ambush. When Callahan comes for her, and he will come, we kill him and anyone stupid enough to ride with him. Then we track down the Chen girl and make them all pay for wasting our time." They broke camp in a fury, dragging Nora back onto a horse and riding hard toward the east. She'd bought Sarah time, but now she'd put Jack directly in Pike's crosshairs. The plan was working, but the cost kept climbing. Back at the ranch, Jack had waited exactly as long as he could stand before swinging into action. Miguel returned with news that the marshal would come, but needed 3 days to gather men and jurisdiction. 3 days was too long, so Jack did what he'd known he'd have to do from the beginning. He went after Nora himself. Preacher and Tom came with him, 2 men against 12, tracking through terrain that could hide an army. They followed the signs Nora had left. A thread from her dress caught on a branch, a specific pattern of horse droppings that Preacher could read like words, the thin wire signal that Jack's jury-rigged tracker could barely detect. "She's smart," Preacher said as they followed the trail, leaving signs without making it obvious. "Girl's got survival instincts like I've never seen." "She learned them the hard way," Jack said grimly, his eyes scanning the landscape ahead. "Same way she learned everything else." They rode through the day and into the night, stopping only when the trail became too dark to follow safely. Jack sat by their small fire, cleaning his rifle for the 3rd time, unable to rest while Nora was out there somewhere with men who'd already proven their capacity for cruelty. "We'll find her," Tom said quietly, "and we'll make them pay for touching her. We'll find her alive, Jack corrected, his voice hard. That's the only acceptable outcome. Jack, Preacher said carefully, you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that— No, Jack interrupted, I don't, because that possibility doesn't exist. Nora's alive and we're bringing her home. That's it. That's the only plan. The old man studied him in the firelight. You love her. It wasn't a question, but Jack answered anyway. Yeah, I do. Took me long enough to figure it out, but yeah, I love her. And I'll be damned if I let her sacrifice herself because I was too stupid to tell her that before she walked into danger. Then we'd better ride fast, Preacher said, settling his hat over his eyes. Because something tells me Pike's figured out he got played, and men like that don't take kindly to being made fools of. They set out again before dawn, pushing their horses hard, following the trail that Nora had left like breadcrumbs through a deadly forest. And somewhere ahead, Nora endured the consequences of her choice, keeping herself alive through sheer force of will and the absolute certainty that Jack Callahan kept his promises. The collision was coming, inevitable as gravity, violent as thunder. And when it arrived, the Arizona Territory would learn what happened when you threatened the people Jack Callahan had claimed as his own. The ambush site Pike chose was a narrow canyon about 5 miles east of Jack's ranch, where the trail squeezed between red rock walls that rose like the ribs of some ancient beast. It was perfect tactical ground, high positions for shooters, limited escape routes, natural cover everywhere. Pike positioned his men with military precision, spreading them across the canyon rim where they could rain death down on anyone foolish enough to ride through. Nora sat in the canyon bottom, still tied to a scrubby juniper tree, her face swollen from Pike's fists and her body aching from 2 days of rough treatment. They'd stopped bothering to feed her regularly, giving her just enough water to keep her conscious. Pike wanted her alert when Jack arrived, wanted her to watch him die, wanted to break whatever spirit she had left by making her witness her own rescue turning into a massacre. He'll come, Pike said, crouching beside her in the pre-dawn darkness of the second day. Men like Callahan, they can't help themselves. They think they're heroes, think they're doing God's work saving broken women. He'll ride right into this canyon thinking he's going to rescue you, and then we'll teach him what happens to men who interfere with business. You don't know him, Nora said through split lips. You think you do, but you don't. I know his type, Pike said dismissively. Self-righteous. Thinks the rules don't apply to him. Probably half in love with you and too stupid to admit it. I've killed a dozen men just like him. Then you've never met anyone like him, Nora said. And despite everything, the pain, the fear, the very real possibility that she was going to die in this godforsaken canyon, she smiled. Because Jack Callahan doesn't ride into ambushes, he burns them down. Pike backhanded her casually, almost bored with the violence. Keep telling yourself that. Maybe it'll comfort you while you watch him bleed out. But Nora's words proved more prophetic than Pike could have imagined, because Jack wasn't riding into the canyon at all. He was circling it, studying it from a distance with Preacher's field glasses, mapping every position, counting every man, calculating odds that would have made a sane person turn back. 12 men, Preacher confirmed, lowering his own glasses. All positioned on the high ground. They've got the canyon locked down tight. Anybody rides through there is dead before they clear the first 50 yards. Good thing we're not riding through then, Jack said calmly. What are you thinking? Tom asked, though from the look on Jack's face, he probably didn't want to know. Jack pointed to the canyon's western rim, where the rock formations created a natural staircase. We climb. Get above them. Come at them from behind. They're watching the canyon floor, not their backs. That's a 100-foot climb, Preacher said. In the dark. One slip and we're dead. One ride through that canyon and we're dead anyway, Jack replied. At least this way we choose how we die. They left their horses hidden in a box canyon a mile back and began the climb just as the first gray light of dawn started touching the eastern sky. It was brutal work, handholds that crumbled under their weight, edges that cut through gloves, moments where the only thing between them and a fatal fall was grip strength and desperation. Jack led the way, testing each hold before trusting it with his weight, finding paths that shouldn't have existed but somehow did. Halfway up, Tom's foot slipped, and he dangled for a heart-stopping moment over empty air before Preacher grabbed his belt and hauled him back against the rock face. They clung there, breathing hard, not daring to look down at how far they'd climbed, or how far they had left to go. "Still think this is better than riding through?" Tom whispered. "Ask me when we're done," Jack replied, and kept climbing. They reached the rim just as the sun broke over the horizon, flooding the canyon with golden light. Below them, spread out along the canyon walls, Pike's men were visible now, some sleeping at their posts, others keeping watch but focused on the canyon floor, none of them expecting an attack from above. And there, in the canyon bottom, Jack could see Nora tied to a tree. Even from this distance, he could see the damage Pike had done to her, the way she held herself, the dark stains on her dress that could only be blood. Something cold and ancient and absolutely murderous rose up in his chest, a killing rage that he'd kept locked away since Elena's death, a fury that had been waiting for a target worthy of its terrible focus. "Easy," Preacher whispered, reading the violence in Jack's posture. "We need to be smart about this." "I am being smart," Jack said, his voice empty of everything except purpose. Smart would be killing them all and letting God sort out who deserved it. He moved along the rim with Preacher and Tom following, positioning themselves above 3 of Pike's men who were clustered together, sharing coffee and watching the eastern approach to the canyon. Jack pulled his knife. He'd left the rifle behind for the climb and gestured for the other 2 to do the same. "Quiet," he mouthed. "Fast." They dropped on the men like wolves on sheep, 3 blades finding throats before anyone could cry out. It was brutal, efficient, and absolutely necessary. Jack felt nothing as he lowered the body of the man he'd killed, felt only the grim satisfaction of evening a score that had been too long unpaid. But one of the dying men's boots scraped rock as he fell, and the sound carried in the morning silence. 50 yards away, another of Pike's men turned at the noise, saw the bodies, saw Jack and his companions, and managed to get out half a shout before Preacher's thrown knife took him in the chest. The ambush had just become a firefight. Pike's men scattered for cover, shouting warnings, bringing rifles to bear on the unexpected attackers. Jack rolled behind a boulder as bullets sparked off rock where his head had been a moment before. Tom and Preacher found their own cover, and suddenly the canyon was alive with gunfire and echoing chaos. "Callahan!" Pike's voice roared from somewhere in the chaos. "I should have known you'd be too stupid to die easy, but you're outnumbered. Throw down your guns and maybe I'll let you watch your woman die quick." "How about you come up here and make me?" Jack shouted back, levering a round into the rifle he'd taken from one of the dead men. He leaned out and fired, felt the satisfaction of seeing one of Pike's men spin away clutching a shattered shoulder. The battle was desperate and chaotic, fought at close quarters where every shot mattered, and hesitation meant death. Jack moved like a man possessed, advancing from cover to cover, his rifle barking out a rhythm of vengeance. He'd spent 6 years on this ranch trying to outrun his guilt over Elena, trying to live small and quiet and unnoticed. But that man was gone now, burned away by the need to save Nora, and what remained was someone harder, colder, more dangerous than he'd ever allowed himself to be. Preacher fought with the calm efficiency of someone who'd seen too many battles to get excited about one more, his shots measured and precise. Tom showed surprising courage for someone half his age, holding his position and providing covering fire when Jack and Preacher needed to move. But they were still 3 against 9, and Pike's men were professionals who knew their business. The fight ground on through the morning, each side trading shots, probing for weaknesses, trying to gain advantage. Jack took a bullet through his left arm and barely noticed, too focused on the next shot, the next target, the next move that would get him closer to Nora. In the canyon below, Nora had heard the first shots and felt hope surge through her battered body. Jack had come, just like he'd promised. But as the gunfight raged above her, she realized that hope wasn't enough. Jack was fighting impossible odds, and even if he won, he might not survive it. She needed to help, needed to do more than just sit here being rescued like some helpless damsel. The ropes around her wrists had loosened from days of working them, and the chaos of the battle meant no one was watching her closely anymore. Nora took a deep breath, said a prayer to whatever god looked after foolish women, and began pulling her hands free. The rope scraped skin raw and made her wounds bleed fresh. But pain was familiar, and she pushed through it with the same stubborn will that had kept her alive this long. Her hands came free just as one of Pike's men, the youngest, barely 20, came sliding down from his position on the canyon wall, clearly ordered to guard the prisoner more closely. He landed hard, stumbled, and before he could recover, Nora was on him. She drove her shoulder into his stomach with all her weight, sending them both crashing to the ground. His rifle went flying, and Nora's hands found a rock, smooth and heavy and perfect. She brought it down on his temple with a sound that would haunt her dreams for years, but she didn't hesitate. Survival had taught her there was no room for mercy when your life was the price of kindness. The man went limp, and Nora grabbed his rifle, checked that it was loaded, and began climbing toward the sounds of battle. She emerged onto the canyon rim into absolute chaos. Bodies lay scattered among the rocks, both Pike's men, and her heart stopped. Was that Tom Yates? She couldn't tell from this angle, couldn't afford to look closer because movement to her left drew her attention, and she turned to see one of Pike's men drawing a bead on a figure pinned behind a boulder. Jack. It was Jack, reloading his rifle, completely exposed for the 3 seconds it would take Pike's man to line up a killing shot. Nora didn't think. She raised the rifle she'd taken, aimed the way Jack had taught her, and squeezed the trigger. The recoil nearly knocked her over, but the shot flew true, and Pike's man crumpled with a hole through his chest. The sound drew attention. Jack's head snapped around, and their eyes met across 30 yards of chaos and carnage. The relief and terror on his face were so naked, so raw, that Nora felt something break open in her chest. But there was no time for feelings, no time for anything except survival, because Pike himself was emerging from cover now, his scarred face twisted with rage, a pistol in each hand. "You bitch!" he screamed at Nora. "You broke my nose, cost me the Chen girl, killed my men. I'm gonna gut you slow and make Callahan watch." He advanced on her, firing as he came, and Nora dropped behind cover as bullets chewed up rock where she'd been standing. She tried to work the rifle's action, but it jammed, spent brass caught in the mechanism, and suddenly she was unarmed with a killer bearing down on her. But Jack was already moving, sprinting across open ground with complete disregard for the remaining shooters, his rifle up and firing. He took down one man, then another, and then he was between Nora and Pike, a living shield, his gun clicking empty. Pike smiled like a wolf. "Out of bullets, hero? That's a damn shame." "Don't need bullets for you," Jack said, and dropped the rifle. "Been wanting to do this with my hands anyway." They came together like two locomotives colliding, all violence and fury and years of accumulated rage finding focus. Pike was bigger, heavier, brutal in his approach, but Jack fought with the controlled precision of someone who'd learned to channel emotion into effective violence, every punch placed with purpose, every movement economical and devastating. They rolled across rock and dirt, trading blows that would have killed lesser men. Pike got his hands around Jack's throat and squeezed, his thumbs digging into windpipe, his face purple with effort and hate. Jack's vision started to tunnel, darkness creeping in from the edges, but before consciousness left him completely, he drove his thumb into Pike's eye socket with all the strength he had left. Pike screamed and released his grip, clutching his ruined eye, and Jack gasped in air that tasted like blood and dust and something that might have been victory. He dragged himself up and kicked Pike in the ribs, felt them crack, kicked him again, because once wasn't enough for what this man had done to Nora. "Jack," Nora's voice, rough but steady. "Jack, that's enough. He's done." Jack looked at Pike, broken, bleeding, crawling away, and then at Nora standing there with dirt in her hair and blood on her dress and absolute certainty in her eyes. She was right. Pike was done. The fight was over. Jack straightened slowly, feeling every wound he'd taken, every year of his life settling into his bones. Around them, the canyon had gone quiet. Preacher was tying up the 2 remaining members of Pike's crew who'd surrendered when they saw which way the wind was blowing. Tom Yates was alive but wounded, being tended by Preacher with quick efficiency. And Nora stood there, alive and fierce, and so beautiful in her damaged state that Jack felt his heart do something complicated in his chest. "You came," she said unnecessarily. "Did you think I wouldn't?" Jack asked, moving toward her carefully, like she might spook. "I knew you would," Nora corrected. "I was counting on it. But knowing and seeing are different things." Jack reached her and lifted one hand to her face, touching her split lip with gentle fingers, cataloging the damage Pike had done with a kind of distant rage that he'd process later. "I'm sorry I didn't get here sooner." "You got here in time," Nora said. "That's what matters." They stood there in the wreckage of the ambush, neither quite able to articulate the things that needed saying. Finally, Preacher's voice called from across the canyon. "Hate to interrupt, but we should move. No telling if Pike had more men coming, and some of these wounds need proper tending." The ride back to the ranch was a blur of pain and exhaustion. Tom rode double with Preacher, his shoulder bound but still seeping blood. Pike and his surviving men were tied to their saddles, heading for a jail cell and a judge who might actually care about justice. And Jack and Nora rode side by side, neither speaking, both processing the fact that they were alive when by all rights they should be dead. Miguel met them at the ranch with news that the marshal had arrived with deputies, that Sarah and Charlie had sent word they'd crossed into California safely, that Mrs. Chen was coming to thank Jack personally for saving her daughter. But all Jack could focus on was getting Nora inside, getting her cleaned up, making sure she was really all right. He helped her down from her horse and she swayed, exhaustion finally catching up with adrenaline. Jack caught her automatically and suddenly they were pressed together, her face against his chest, his arms around her like he could hold all her broken pieces in place through sheer will. "I thought I'd lost you," he said into her hair. "When Pike took you, when I saw what he'd done to your face, I thought I'd been too late again. Thought I'd failed you the way I failed Elena." "You didn't fail Elena," Nora said fiercely, "and you didn't fail me. You saved me, Jack, not just from Pike, from everything, from believing I wasn't worth saving." Jack pulled back enough to look at her face, tilting her chin up so he could meet her eyes. "You need to know something," he said, his voice rough. "When you offered to trade yourself for Sarah, when you walked into that danger, I should have told you then, but I was too scared, too stupid." "Told me what?" Nora asked, though something in her eyes said she already knew. "That I love you," Jack said simply. "That somewhere between the auction block and now, you became the most important thing in my life. That I don't want you working for your keep or earning your place or any of that. I just want you here because you want to be here, because you choose to be here." Nora's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment Jack thought he'd said the wrong thing, pushed too hard, asked for too much. But then she was laughing through the tears, wincing because it hurt her split lip, but laughing anyway. "You stubborn, impossible man," she said. "I've been in love with you since you left that first flower on my windowsill. Maybe even before that. Maybe from the moment you tore up that contract and told me to walk away." "Then why didn't you say anything?" Jack asked. "Because I'm an idiot," Nora said. "Because I didn't think I deserved to love someone like you. Because I was scared that if I said it out loud, you'd realize you could do better." "There is no better," Jack said firmly. "There's just you. And if you'll have me, if you can stand to put up with a broken-down rancher with more ghosts than good sense, then I'd like to stop pretending this is temporary. I'd like to make it permanent." "Jack Callahan," Nora said, her voice shaking with emotion. "Are you proposing to me while I look like I lost a fight with a mountain lion?" "I'm saying I don't want to waste another day," Jack replied. "I'm saying that life's too short and too brutal to spend it alone when we could spend it together. I'm saying—" He stopped, suddenly uncertain. "Unless you need time. Unless I'm rushing." Nora kissed him, cutting off his words with her mouth on his, ignoring the pain in her lip because some things were more important than pain. She kissed him like she'd wanted to for weeks, like she'd dreamed about in her small locked room, like he was water and she was dying of thirst. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Jack was smiling in a way Preacher would later describe as absolutely idiotic and completely perfect. "I'm going to take that as a yes," he said. "That's a yes," Nora confirmed, "but I'm not sure I'll be any good at being someone's wife. I don't know the first thing about—" "Then we'll learn together," Jack said, echoing the words from what felt like a lifetime ago. Over the following weeks, the territory slowly returned to something like normal. Pike and his surviving men faced trial in Tucson, where a judge less corrupt than Harrison threw the book at them for kidnapping, assault, and attempted murder. Sarah sent letters from California describing her new life with a family who treated her like a daughter instead of property. Mrs. Chen visited the ranch and wept over Jack and Nora, blessing them in Chinese and English, promising that her family would remember this debt forever. The town of Salvation Creek remained divided. Some folks, like Mrs. Havens, continued to spread gossip about the impropriety of Jack and Nora's arrangement. But others, more than Jack had expected, came by the ranch to offer quiet congratulations, to to thank him for doing what they'd been too afraid to do, to admit that maybe there were things more important than respectability. Dutch Keller, interestingly, never came around again. Word was he'd lost money betting on Pike, and the loss of face had damaged his standing in the community. Jack didn't care enough to investigate further. Some men weren't worth the energy of hatred. Spring came early that year, painting the desert in unexpected colors. Wildflowers bloomed in places that hadn't seen rain in years, and the ranch, through hard work and luck and sheer stubborn will, began to thrive. Jack and Nora worked side by side through the days, learning each other's rhythms, building something that was stronger than either of them alone. They were married on a Sunday morning in May, standing in the yard of the ranch with preacher officiating and a small group of friends gathered to witness. Nora wore a simple white dress that Mrs. Chen had sewn for her, and Jack wore his best shirt with his hair actually combed for once. There were no fancy decorations, no elaborate ceremony, just two people who'd been broken by the world standing together and promising to help each other heal. When preacher asked if they had rings, Jack pulled out a small wooden box. Inside lay a simple silver band forged from an old horseshoe he'd found in the barn, the same barn where Nora had hidden from Pike's men, the same barn where she'd first learned to shoot, where she'd begun learning to trust. "I don't want to own you," Jack said as he slid the ring onto her finger, echoing the words he'd said all those months ago on the auction block. "I just want to walk beside you, if you'll let me." "I'm not sure I'll be any good at being someone's wife," Nora replied, her voice thick with emotion. "But I'm willing to learn." "Then we'll learn together," Jack said, and kissed her as the sun rose over the desert, painting everything in shades of gold and promise. That night, as they lay together in Jack's room, their room now, Nora traced the scars on his arm where Pike's bullet had grazed him. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "Stopping at that auction? Taking me home? Everything that came after?" Jack was quiet for a long moment, thinking about Elena and Mrs. Chen and Sarah and all the ways that grace and debt and love got tangled up together. Thinking about how a single dollar could change the trajectory of two lives, how one moment of courage could ripple out into consequences neither of them could have imagined. "No," he said finally. "The only thing I regret is that I didn't do it sooner, that I wasted so many years thinking my pain was the only thing that mattered. But you taught me something, Nora. You taught me that the opposite of pain isn't happiness, it's purpose. And you gave me purpose again. You gave me everything," Nora said simply. "You gave me back my life." "No," Jack corrected gently. "You took your life back. I just gave you space to do it." They fell asleep wrapped around each other, two people who'd been sold and broken and lost, now found and healing and whole. Outside, the desert night stretched endlessly, stars scattered across black velvet like seeds of hope. Coyotes called in the distance, wild and free and alive. Years later, when people asked about the ring Nora wore and the story behind it, she would smile and say it had cost exactly $1. And when they looked confused, she would explain about the auction block and the rancher who'd bought her freedom instead of her body, who'd given her space to heal and time to remember who she was before the world tried to break her. Some listeners would understand. Others would judge, would whisper about propriety and scandal and women who didn't know their place. But Nora had learned to stop caring about the opinions of people who'd never had to fight for their own humanity. She had a ranch to run, a husband who loved her, and occasionally a frightened girl or woman who'd heard the story and found their way to her door, looking for the same things she'd once needed: a place to breathe, space to heal, someone willing to stand between them and a world that saw them as property instead of people. And every morning, without fail, Nora woke to find a small gift on her windowsill. Sometimes a flower, sometimes a smooth stone, sometimes just a cup of coffee growing cold while she slept late. They were Jack's way of saying what he still sometimes struggled to articulate: that she was precious, that she was chosen, that she was loved. On their first anniversary, Nora gave him a gift of her own. It was a small wooden box, carefully carved and polished smooth. Inside was a single silver dollar, the same one he'd paid at the auction, which she'd tracked down through Abel Pritchard and bought back with money she'd saved from selling eggs in town. "What's this?" Jack asked, turning the coin over in his fingers. "A reminder," Nora said, "of what we're worth. Not what other people say we're worth. what we say we're worth, and what we're worth to each other. Jack looked at the coin, then at his wife with her fierce eyes and strong hands and heart that had somehow survived everything the world had thrown at it. He pulled her close and kissed her forehead. "Best dollar I ever spent," he said. "Best dollar I ever cost," Nora replied, and they stood together on the porch of their small ranch, watching the sun set over the desert. They'd learned to love because it was honest in its harshness, because it demanded strength and rewarded resilience, because it was the perfect place for two broken people to build something new. The past would always be there. Elena's ghost, Nora's scars, the memories of auction blocks and brutality. But the past was just that, past. And the future stretched out before them like the desert itself, vast and challenging and full of terrible, beautiful possibility. They'd chosen each other, not because the law said so or society approved or it made sense to anyone else. They'd chosen each other because sometimes the only way to survive the darkness is to find someone willing to hold the light beside you, because sometimes the only way to heal is to give someone else space to heal too, because sometimes love is just the stubborn insistence that another person's worth is infinite and undeniable, regardless of what the world says. Jack had said he already regretted waiting so long to choose her, and every day after, through work and worry and occasional wonder, he proved that those words weren't empty. He chose her in 1,000 small ways, in coffee poured before she woke, in patience when nightmares made her thrash and cry out, in the steady presence that said you are not alone and you will never be alone again. And Nora chose him back, in biscuits made with care, in shirts mended and fences repaired, in the way she stood beside him against the world's judgment, in the quiet strength that said, "I see your ghosts, and I'm not afraid of them because I have my own, and we can haunt this house together." It wasn't the fairy tale ending that songs and stories promised. There was no magical transformation, no sudden healing of all wounds. Some days were hard. Some nights were haunted. Some memories refused to fade. But it was real. And it was theirs. And that made it more precious than any perfect story could ever be. The desert wind carried their names across the vast Arizona territory. Whispers of the rancher who'd bought a woman's freedom for $1, of the woman who'd traded herself for a girl's safety, of the love that had grown in the spaces between survival and hope. Some people sneered at the story. Others were inspired by it. But Jack and Nora didn't much care either way. They had each other. They had their small piece of harsh, beautiful land. They had purpose and partnership and the kind of peace that can only come from fighting your way through hell and choosing to believe in heaven anyway. And every morning the sun rose over the desert, washing everything clean with light. Every morning a small gift appeared on a windowsill. Every morning 2 people who'd been broken chose to wake up and try again, together. That was the real ending, not dramatic or neat, but true. The kind of ending that wasn't really an ending at all, but rather the beginning of something that would last the rest of their lives. The kind of love that was built not on grand gestures, but on daily choice, not on perfection, but on persistence, not on being saved, but on saving yourself while someone else held your hand. Jack Callahan had said he already regretted waiting so long to choose Nora Hale. And she'd whispered that he'd regret choosing her at all. They'd both been wrong, and they'd both been right, but mostly they'd both been human, flawed and frightened and brave enough to choose love anyway, in a world that made love feel like the most dangerous gamble of all. And in the end, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.